Well, good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee of 2019. I ask everyone to turn any electrical devices to silent. And agenda item 1 is a decision by the committee to take items 5 and 6 in private. Are we agreed on that? Thank you. Now we have with us the Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, Jamie Hepburn, together with Victoria Morton, lawyer from the Scottish Government, and John Cook, who is the Executive Director of Case Operation for the Accountant in Bankruptcy. So welcome to the three of you this morning. And you are here to deal with the Debt Arrangement Scheme Scotland Amendment Regulations 2019. So I'll invite the Minister to make his opening statement on the instrument, first of all. Minister.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you to the committee for taking the time to consider these draft regulations this morning. They make a small number of very welcome and important changes to the Debt Arrangement Scheme, DAS, that are firmly focused on improving the scheme from the viewpoint of the individual accessing it. Virtually all of the feedback I have seen reinforce the strong support for all of these changes, perhaps with the exception of some different views on those issues around Regulation 4, which I know the committee has heard some of and which I will return to. The proposals here provide for greater flexibility and accessibility to DAS. They address issues of capacity to help ensure that more organisations are able to offer the debt arrangement scheme, but only where it's the right solution for someone struggling with their debts. And absolutely crucially, we're removing fees that many DAS clients pay over and above their debt payments, which means that DAS will become free to access by every single client, irrespective of who their money advisor is. DAS is a UK first and a highly successful debt repayment programme, providing protection to those wishing to repay their debt, but who need more time to do so. Over 6,000 people have used the scheme to pay off their debts. There's been a substantial return to creditors, with almost £230 million having been repaid since 2012. Whilst the scheme is a very successful, and I think it's important we listen to feedback and continue to improve it, something I know the committee will agree with as well. I do acknowledge some concerns raised in relation to some specific provisions in the regulations as discussed at your previous evidence sessions. Firstly, I can appreciate the representations that have been made on the need for certainty in the specific funding arrangements for both payments distribution and money advice activities. I would like to reaffirm at this stage, Convener, that the role of money advisor is, of course, greatly valued by the Scottish Government. The sector is highly respective, and the work that they undertake is absolutely critical in helping the people of Scotland with problem debt. The aim of combining the fee was to create a flexibility in the arrangements and allow money advice organisations and payment distributors to come to agreement between themselves. It's also recognised that in many cases the same organisation will undertake both the money advice and payments distribution functions. And it is a move that was supported by 50 out of the 65 responses to the consultation, just over 3/4 of all respondents. And of course the regulations introduce the ability for the accountant in bankruptcy to undertake payments distribution functions as a fallback, with further information published on how it provides for the split in fees for payments distribution and money advice services. There should be absolute clarity on AIB's willingness to undertake payments distribution with this as the preferred option. This clarity will be extended to a structure that will guarantee a return of a minimum of 15% to the advice sector. There is no intent to ensure anything other than administrative costs for AIB are recovered. Any surplus will be returned to the free advice sector to help sustain the essential work they do. I also want to acknowledge the concerns highlighted, in particular by Citizens Advice Scotland, that the transition from the current payments distributor tendering process may increase administrative burden for money advisors. The regulations have, rightly, and I think again the committee would expect this, focused on improving DAS from the debtor's standpoint, but they're also designed to reduce administrative burden on money advisors. There would be streamlined processes for the approval of payment variations. There are also simple arrangements for allowing new emergency payment breaks, which will greatly enhance the scheme and promote sustainability and completion rates. The current tendering process allows for a limited number of companies to cover the payment distributor role. The removal of this promotes flexibility and autonomy for the debtor allowing them to access a wider range of organisations offering DAS, including AIB, who will, and I know Richard Dennis made this point last week, who will take any case on. The legislation stipulates that the payments distributor undertakes their functions on behalf of the debtor. It also provides that an approved advisor is involved in identifying the right solution and providing advice on issues which will include payments distribution arrangements. I do not envisage any undue administrative burden or conflict arising here. There should be simple procedures in place to assist money advisors to provide guidance on the appropriate payments distribution arrangements, and I will take a personal interest to ensure this is the case. In conclusion, Convener, I believe these regulations provide a great opportunity to improve DAS, help ensure that more people can access it where it's the right solution, and help those that do enter DAS to complete it successfully. Along with John and Victoria, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I think certainly the witnesses we've heard from and myself and other members of the committee welcome the good aspects that these regulations bring for the money advice sector and so forth. There were issues, as you've indicated, raised. And I'm just wanting to ask you about response to the committee's letter, which asked if Regulation 4 could be amended so that a minimum percentage of the increased 20% fee could be allocated to funding the free money advice sector. Now, I have a general and a specific question. I suppose the first one is, I appreciate, Minister, you're not writing this letter as a lawyer yourself, and you'll do it on the basis of advice, but you indicate in your letter the 13th September that it would be beyond our powers to use these regulations to specify a minimum percentage of the increased 20% fee, etc. And I think what you're referring to there is the secondary legislation, but there's no specifics given in the letter explaining why this legal proposition is put, as it were, in this letter to the committee, as in setting out in terms of the Act and the regulations, why you say that is. And I'm just wondering, first of all, whether that couldn't be done in future to assist the committee to understand the thinking of yourself as Minister in cases like these, or whether there's a reason it's put in a very general format in this letter.
Okay. Well, certainly in the last point, Convener, I'm very happy to undertake that. You'll appreciate that you asked for a very quick turnaround on that letter, but it's a fair point, and certainly in responding to the committee in future, we'll undertake to try and provide as much explanatory information as possible. You are right, I'm not a lawyer. I have one sitting next to me in the shape of Victoria Martin, so maybe ask her to say a bit more in due course. But in essence, the reason we're not able to do this is that primary legislation sets out through these regulations, or any regulations we took forward in this area of activity, only allows us to set out the fees for those that are actually involved directly in a specific debt payment programme, in this case the money advisor or the payments distributor. So we can set that out. What we can't do through primary legislation and then in turn secondary legislation arising out of that primary legislation is have some form of mechanism where there's a top slicing or effectively a de facto creation of a levy for the free advice sector. So on a simple matter of fact, Convener, we're not able to do that on the basis of the legislation we have. So that's why, with the best will in the world, I've not withdrawn the regulations, because the specific proposition is not one that we could fulfil. What I will say, Convener, is even in the circumstances that we could, though, I would have probably been loath to do so, because throughout the entire process, and there has been a long considered process in reaching this position, that is not a proposition that was actually consulted on. And I think it's important when you come forward with a policy proposition of that nature that you engage with those that are involved in the sector. You actually speak to people about it as a proposition to consider their views. So I'm not suggesting it's not a policy that's without merit. It is one that could perhaps be considered, although we'd need to consider in the round in relation to what we could do on the basis of primary legislation. I don't think we could do it as primary legislation as drafted. We'd also need to have wider considerations beyond the restrictions set out in primary legislation to see if we could even do it in that basis. Now, hopefully that's a comprehensive reply. If you need a more legalistic response, I can invite Victoria to add some more if need be.
Well, that's helpful to explain your position, Minister, but I think we will need to have a response from, if I may say, the lawyer, as it were, to explain where this position comes from.
The lawyer.
But, well, I suppose that's the purpose of Victoria Morton coming in. But can I say, before we turn to that explanation, it is another issue that's been raised, of course, in evidence. The Debt Arrangement Attachment Scotland Act 2002 has been enforced for some time. There have been successive regulations that amend, and witnesses have asked or said there should be a more general overview and review of this whole area rather than continually tweaking the regulations, as it were. Do you have it before, as it were, we go further and put regulations such as this in place? I mean, do you have an answer to that before we come to Victoria Morton?
Well, I do, Convener. Yes, I think there is merit in us reviewing things more widely. You'll be aware we've committed to doing that in the relation to the debt arrangement scheme. But also more widely than that, and in my previous letter to you, which I sent on the 9th of September, which is a response to your letter of the 6th of September, I have set out that we will, going forward, take a wider ranging review of all debt solutions. So that's something I do see merit in. It's something that we've committed to doing. I'll be very happy to come back to the committee to discuss that further. But what I will also say, Convener, is that that's not something that would be able to be put in place overnight. I think the committee will understand that. That could potentially require us to look at the primary legislation we have. That could require wider engagement. If we come to the conclusion it requires some further form of primary legislation, we then need to consult on the specifics. That's some time off. And I think it's also incumbent on us to look at the here and now, and we have an opportunity through these regulations, and indeed perhaps through others that may come, to improve the system that we have just now for the benefit of vulnerable people who may find themselves in debt, who want to try and repay as much of that debt as they can in a sustainable fashion to their creditors. That's what these regulations allow us to do. So I can't commit, I just will simply not commit to saying that we will, in the interim, not bring forward other refinements to the system as we have just now. But yes, absolutely, we should always be willing to consider in the round what we have, and I've given that commitment. I'll be very happy to engage with the committee as we take that commitment forward. All right, perhaps we could turn to Victoria Morton now.
Thank you. So just to really confirm, as the Minister said, the powers underlying these regulations are set out in Section 7 of the Debt Arrangement Attachment Scotland Act 2002. Section 7(2)(ub) provides that Scottish Ministers can make provision for the remuneration of payments distributors and money advisors. And subsection Y says that ministers can make provision for the termination and charging by the Scottish Ministers of fees, and that's the 2% administration fee. So in terms of Regulation 4 and the fees for money advisors and payment distributors, we're really bound by the what's prescribed in that subsection UB, the remuneration of payments distributors and money advisors. So it's the view of the Scottish Government that provision which would go as far as specifying that a minimum percentage, so a top slice, if you like, of all debt payment programmes would be taken aside and put into a pot to be paid out to support the free advice sector. So essentially a levy on all debt payment programmes would go beyond the powers that we have to make provision for remuneration of money advisors and payment distributors.
Thank you. I think the draft regulations proceed under a number of sections in the Act, not just Section 7. But looking at Section 7 that you've referred to, I'm just looking at section 7(1)(b), for example, which refers to the circumstances Scottish ministers can make regulations in regard to, and it says the manner in which such programmes are to operate, including conditions with which debtors, creditors, payment distributors or money advisors must comply. So there's very general and fairly wide sweeping powers set out. This is in the 2002 Act, on which the Scottish ministers can make regulations on that basis, or indeed subsection 3 of section 7, section 7(3)(a), which says the regulations may also make different provision in relation to such different types of debts, debtors, debts, or other matters as may be described by the Scottish ministers. So there's a fairly general power included in the Act, as one often finds in this type of Act. And I mean, you're quite right to point out that there is a huge list of various matters that the regulations are said specifically in subsection 2 that they may be made in regard to. But there are also the general powers in subsection 3, or indeed in subsection 1 of section 7, and that's without looking at any of the other sections of the Act that the draft regulations proceed upon, or indeed whatever other powers are possible under the other sections of the Act. So I'm not quite sure that I see the basis of saying that this would not be possible. I appreciate the Minister said that he doesn't consider it appropriate for the reasons he's given.
It's both, though, convener. So
yes, well, I appreciate that, but I'm just wondering if Victoria Morton has any comment on the more general powers set out in the Act.
Well, the convener is absolutely right. There are general powers, but Scottish Government's view certainly is that in terms of this specific point on the remuneration of fee levels for payment distributors and money advisors, we are bound within the terms of that subsection that I mentioned. I would just note that that was added in 2014 specifically to allow this type of provision to be made. So certainly the view is that in order to make provision on fees, this power was needed, and we are bound by the terms of that power.
So, Convener, you've asked my lawyer for their opinion, and that is the opinion, and that's the basis we move forward on. So, we're very clear that what has been requested can't be done, but you are quite correct, Convener, and I think there is a fundamental point here that if we're going to make good, effective public policy, and a proposition is quite legitimately advanced. I'm not suggesting that what has been proffered here isn't something that could be without merit and could be explored further. If we were to advance it as something, I think it would be incumbent. I think the Parliament would expect us to engage with people to actually ascertain a wide range of views on it, and we've not done that.
Yes, I just think it's perhaps unfortunate that this is the view taken on this point, because I think, as you'll appreciate, and as lawyers such as myself appreciate, the law is not a black and white matter. So to a certain extent, it's the view that one takes of these things, whether or not one has the power to do this, that, or the
we
next.
have to be confident that anything we pass as a legislative instrument, be it primary or secondary legislation, is defensible on a robust basis, lest it falls subject to legal challenge.
Well, I'm sure there are arguments for or against. I think that's my point, and perhaps I'm not entirely persuaded by what has been said on this specific point. But perhaps we could move on to questions from other committee members. First of all, Jackie Bailey.
Yeah. Just focus on the legal point, because I would much rather discuss the substance of an issue as to whether there is some legal barrier to us pursuing this. Can I refer also to section 7(y), because that, as I recollect, was introduced to allow the AIB to charge. And the AIB quite properly are involved in the consideration of applications for approval or the variation of a debt payment programme. Accepting that, as I do, and you do as well, because I'm seeing you nod your head, you could actually argue that a money advisor makes those applications. They are responsible for the variation of debt programmes, and therefore under that exact same regulation as the AIB makes their 2% charge, you could actually bring forward charges in relation, or fees set aside in relation to money advisors. It's exactly the same principle, and they do the same job.
Sorry, that, with respect, Ms. Bailey, unless we, and it wouldn't have been willfully, misinterpreted what the committee had requested. Essentially what was, well,
It
well,
wasn't-
sorry.
In fairness, it wasn't a
It
question.
wouldn't have, I can assure you it would not have been willfully, Ms Bailey.
Okay, indeed, I accept
but
that point.
What the committee asked, I've got the letter in front of me and I'll refer back to it as necessary, effectively was for top slicing of what exists for funding for the free money advice sector. Now that seemed to be what was requested within the letter.
Okay, well, in that case, I'm sorry if the letter gave you the wrong impression. That certainly wasn't what the committee had discussed and taken evidence on. Rather, if I could sum it up as payment advisors, free payment advisors who were not payment distributors would be entitled to get paid regardless of who the payment distributor was. Okay, so it is different to the question you've answered. But what I'm doing is homing in on section 7Y and asking a technical question, if I might, that is the basis on which the AIB charges their 2%. If we agree that money advisors are involved in, the first part of the clause, consideration of applications, they make the applications, and as part of the process, that is part of the process of consideration. They also do the variations, which is referred to in that clause. Could we not use that as a mechanism to pay money advisors in the same way as you set a fee for the AIB?
I'll invite Victoria to talk to some of the specifics, but I do think it's important to bottom out this point. I mean, I've got the letter from the committee in front of me. It says the committee asked the Scottish Government to consider amending Regulation 4 by withdrawing and relaying the instrument so that regardless of the choice of payment distributor, a minimum percentage of the increased 20% fee is allocated to funding the free money advice sector. So I think I've interpreted the question correctly. But I do concede that Ms Bailey's question is wider than that. I'll invite Victoria to talk about the legal specifics, and then we can perhaps engage in talking about some of the policy issues that I think are involved in that.
Minister, before you do that, I think we should clarify, of course, that that was a follow-up letter from a much more extensive letter, and I'm sure as Minister you look at requests of committees not literally out of context, as it were, and also try to be helpful in terms of seeing what way it might be possible to respond to a committee to meet it halfway, and perhaps if the specifics in the letter on the advice you're given are not possible, that there might be another way. But
well, I'm happy to discuss that, Convener, but with due respect, I find it hard not to respond to the specifics of a very specific question that I'm asked in the written form. But of course, I'm always willing to discuss these matters in terms of our policy approach. But I'll ask
we'll let you pass on to Victoria Morton to respond to Jackie Bailey's point. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. In relation to Ms Bailey's specific point, you'd appreciate that's certainly not the way that that specific power has been used hitherto, and that's not a proposal that I have been made aware of. I'm sure you'll appreciate that we would need to go away and consider that suggestion carefully in light of the boundaries of the power that ministers have there.
So it wouldn't exclude that approach. I'm simply trying to work with the spirit and the actuality of the regulations to find a way of doing this if people are minded to do it. And I think I'm using exactly the wording and the phraseology that's in those regulations.
You'd appreciate that. I can't confirm that without having further consideration on that point.
I wonder if you don't mind, if Ms Bailey could clarify for me a bit more precisely, without necessarily referring to every specific aspect of primary legislation, what the policy proposition is she's advancing.
No. What I'm doing, and you'll hear from questions from the committee and in our debate what the policy proposition is, I simply note that your very helpful comments about consultation I couldn't disagree with at all. Yet that's exactly what's not been done in relation to Regulation 4 before the regulations were laid.
I'm sorry, that's fundamentally not the case. The whole everything.
We'll come to that in questioning. So we will explore the substance.
Well, this is questioning, isn't it? So I'm answering your question. That is fundamentally not the case. Every element of these regulations has been consulted upon. Convener,
I'm trying to ask about a very specific bit of the regulations. I'm not moving to the questioning on the policy at this stage. So I am trying to understand the legal basis on which these are made. The lawyer representing the Scottish Government has said they need time to take this away and consider it.
Sorry, Ms Bailey. You're making a point that these have not been consulted on. That's fundamentally not the case, Convener.
they haven't.
This has been subject to a considerable
Regulation
piece
4
of work, and I'm sorry, I'm bound to say that is not the case, that these have not been consulted on. I accept, I'm fully conceding, it's very clear that there are a difference of opinion on elements of these regulations, but that does not equate to the fact that they've not been consulted on. That's simply not the case.
Convener, they weren't
Well,
consulted
Minister,
on
sorry.
before the regulations were laid.
Minister, you've made your point, and
Wrong.
Jackie
I beg
Bailey.
pardon, it's not wrong.
I think we need to let Jackie Bailey make the point. If you could do so, and then put the question, please, Ms Bailey.
The regulation in relation to Regulation 4 was not consulted on before the regulations were laid. The consultation finished last week, and had they been consulted on in the same fashion as they were with the other regulations, which have been broadly welcomed, we probably wouldn't be having a debate just now.
This comes on to a fundamental and, with the best one will miss, assumption about the nature of these regulations. That's the consultation that was taken forward last week was a very specific element about utilising the opportunity afforded through these regulations that the EIB has set out. It can act as a payment distributor, and it has made a very clear commitment at my behest, at my instruction, that it will do no more than cover the costs of administration, and all the rest of the funding will return to the free advice sector. That was the only element of that consultation. That is not a core part of these regulations. We're taking the opportunities these regulations afford to be able to provide some, and I think Richard Dennis made this point last week, Convener, some limited funds to be returned to the free advice sector. They're not fundamental to these regulations. It's a bonus. These regulations in their entirety have been consulted upon. They have been brought forward on the basis of a considerable piece of work engaging with stakeholders that have widespread support across the sector. So the idea that they've not been consulted on is fundamentally wrong, and anyone who's arguing that is undoing it on the basis of a misunderstanding.
Well, I think we'll move on to Andy Whiteman now.
So I just want to seek a little bit more clarification on this point. I mean, I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding by the Minister about what the committee is looking for. I don't think the committee is looking for top slicing from the fees to create a pot. I perfectly accept that that's, for the sake of argument, that's not something the regulation could provide for. The proposition was put to us by the AIB that a free money advisor would be able to seek some remuneration for their services from a payment distributor in the private sector by negotiation with them, or by, if they went with the AIB as payment distributor, the 15% that the AIB is committed to. And therefore there's a competition there in the private sector. Payment distributor would have to match what the AIB was willing to do, etc. So that, the proposition was that in the free money advice sector, they would be able to achieve remuneration by the competition that existed between the AIB being a backstop, as it were, and the policy commitment they'd given on the 15%, or negotiation with the payment distributor. Mm-hmm. The concern is that neither of those is given any statutory effect in these regulations. There's no guarantee that those fees would be available. So, I mean, my first question is, given that this is not, the committee is not asking for a general levy to create a pot, then does Regulation 7 in the Act, sorry, in the 2002 Act, does Section 7UB, which talks about regulations being made for the remuneration of payment distributors and money advisors, would that not allow these regulations to make a specified provision for free money advisors that they were guaranteed a certain proportion of the 20%?
In all cases?
No, in cases where they acted for the debtor.
Potentially yes, but they will get payment.
Well, no, that's the fundamental point, is that...
So there's not going to be any circumstances whereby a payment distributor is going to take the full 20%. That's just not going to happen. That's not the way it's going to...
How can you say that? How do you know that?
Because the money advisor is involved in the process. The money advisor is the first point of contact with the individual. So it's the money advisor that's facilitating the interaction with the payment distributor. So they are the ones that will form a relationship with the payment distributor, and they will have to come to an agreement. So yeah, Mr. Whiteman is correct. We could, in theory, say that in all cases, and it wouldn't just be limited to, I don't think we could limit it just to the free money advice sector. It would need to be across the board. We could say that there is this 5%, 15% division in all cases. Of course, what that would potentially do is restrict those cases whereby actually the payment distributor says they can do it for less than more could be returned to the money advisor. So that's very much the basis on which this is designed to move forward. It's also designed to try and incentivise a greater range of organisations into the system so that we can make DAS a more widely utilised system. So that's the basis on which we've proceeded. But yes, quite clearly, yes, we could do it. I would go back to the point I've made that we haven't actually consulted on that as a proposition. So again, I think it would be wrong for me to say, well, we're definitely going to do that without having to go back to the start of the process and consult with everyone to see whether that's an approach that they would want to take. Actually, the approach we have set out here has widespread support. What, of course, is incumbent on us, and the committee has my clear commitment, and I think it's very clear we do this because that's why regulations are brought forward to try and improve the system. We'll need to monitor that, Mr. Whiteman. We'll need to see if the approach we've taken is an effective one. That's something we'll need to look into and see if it is working as a policy proposition, as I hope we will legislate for. If it isn't, then of course we return to the subject. I see no reason why it won't, though. It's very much designed to facilitate the opportunity for advisors and payment distributors to create relationships, to work together in the best interests of the individual debtor, who, after all, is the person that we should be absolutely focusing on here. In terms of the idea that we could have a specific regulation for the IB function, I think I set out in my letter before last to you, convener. That's something I'm quite relaxed about looking at. I don't think it's necessary. You've had a very clear and public commitment. All of the elements of the funding that's gathered and then disbursed will be publicly available through the normal accounting mechanism for the accountant bankruptcy. So this committee, any individual that is out there that wants to look at those accounts will be able to scrutinise it and say, well, are they actually doing what they said they would? But I'm open to the proposition that some other form of supplementary statutory instrument could be brought forward. I don't think that's a reason not to pass these here and now, because there are many benefits for individual debtors and their creditors through the provision of these regulations, through them going through Parliament today. Okay. To not pass them today on the basis that there could be some further refinement in relation to that very narrow area would be very much throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, just one sort of final point before I pass back to the Chair. I'll come back to other questions later. You talked there about the possibility of a separate set of regulations giving a statutory underpinning to the commitments given by the AIB on the 15%. Mm-hmm. Under what primary legislation would those powers be introduced? Where are they to be introduced?
My supposition would be the same one we're discussing right now, but I'd need to hand over to Victoria to offer more specifics.
Thank you. Yes, it would be the same power. We consider that would fall under the remuneration of payments distributors and money advisors to set out the element of the administration fee in gathered, which would fall to be assessed as a payment distributor fee.
So that's the 7UB, which is the same one
that's
we
correct.
were just talking about. So it would in fact be possible to give that statutory effect by withdrawing and relaying this instrument?
It would be possible, but I see absolutely no reason for us to do it. I have to say, convener, okay, the almost exclusive focus of questioning, and it's entirely up to the committee what questions they want to ask me, the almost exclusive line of questioning thus far, and as far as I could see over the previous sessions, was about how payment distributors and money advisors would be paid. Now that's important, I'm not disputing that. That's a necessary part of sustaining that element of the system that only allows the whole system to function. But actually, we're forgetting that what these regulations are primarily designed to do is to ensure that vulnerable debtors can access a system that involves them avoiding becoming insolvent, that involves them being able to repay their debts in a sustainable fashion, and that all the evidence shows actually offers a better return to creditors than other debt solutions. That's what this is about, and that's what we should, I think, be focusing on.
Minister, perhaps questions are put about issues that the committee is not clear on or not happy about, and therefore there may be very few issues in these regulations, and that may be the reason, because I think, as was indicated at the outset, a lot of what is in these regulations is welcomed, including by those who have the difficulty with Regulation 4 as it's currently drafted.
Well, I hope that will be borne in mind then, Convener, because that's what these regulations are about.
Well, the committee will make up its own mind, Minister, on these regulations. Did you have any further questions, Mr. Whiteman?
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Lyle has a question to raise.
Yeah, well, I only joined this committee last week, Minister, and I made a comment last week that I was 30 years in the debt trade. Can I say I welcome what the government's doing? I welcome your comment, and you hit the nail on the head there. This is to resolve the problem for debtors, not to cover other people or make money for other people. It actually is taking away unfair charges from debtors where unscrupulous companies fleeced debtors for years, and I was totally against that and tried to ensure that it didn't happen in the job that I'd done when I worked for the Royal Bank of Scotland. So, but to answer the questions, and I see the point that you're making, it's not been consulted on. Would you intend, based on the concerns or the observations been made by members today, would you intend, in your letter of the 9th of September, you acknowledge calls for a general review of debt solutions. Could you explain in more detail what the Scottish Government plans to do in this area, and would you intend to further consult on items raised by members in the committee to make this even better in what you're proposing just now?
Well, of course, it's incumbent on us to do that, Mr. Lyle. I have made that high-level commitment to have that overarching, wider-ranging review. We've not worked through the specifics of what that will be. My intention would be to try and do that as soon as possible, or start the process as soon as possible. And inevitably, some of these issues will arise. And again, through the ongoing and regular interaction we have with stakeholders, these issues will continue to be discussed. I had a meeting that I've just instituted on a regular basis with a range of stakeholders with interest in debt solutions. And we're discussing some of these matters. So these issues will stay under constant discussion. But even if I were to withdraw these right now, we're not going to have time for me to engage in any form of meaningful consultation to
I'm not asking you to withdraw them. Well, I'm not asking you to withdraw them. I think what we're doing is actually moving forward. For the last 20 odd years, people have been ripped off. Now is the time for fairness, and I think what you're doing is fair. So, but I'll concentrate on the questions I want to ask, not on other people's questions. So, you'll remember that the committee previously called on the Scottish Government to carry out a review of options for calculating a debtor's available income to repay creditors. A question I asked last week, this is basically in your letter, I read that any case where the free advice sector wishes to use the agency's facilities will be taken up. Can I get a commitment that if any case is put to you, you will take that forward? Not the high end of the market, even the middle or the low end of the market can apply to get free of debt by using the facility that you are now proposing.
You mean, will the accountant in bankruptcy take on any...
Yes.
Yes.
That's excellent news, and I'll make sure there's quite a lot of cases that are referred to you by the money advice centres in my area.
Well, I'm not sure how John feels about that proposition, but we'll be dealing with them anyway.
There's only one concern I have, and I'll finish up, Convener, with this question. On questions I raised last week, all over Twitter, there was concerns put by step change. who are a well-known facilitator. And Step Change is saying that they're not happy with, and this is a question that I asked last week also, are not happy with the software, and it is reporting that it's certainly not doing what it should be doing. Can you answer their concerns? And maybe Mr Cook would like to confirm again what his boss said last week.
I mean, I can invite John in to say some more. I think it's important to place on the record so there's no misunderstanding, though I believe Step Change are in favour of these regulations and urge they're passed. But in relation to the DAS case management system, Eden, it is live. The existing caseload was migrated on 23rd of July. Yes, as is almost inevitably the case when you migrate a caseload, there are some issues have been identified. These are being worked through and fixed just now, but essentially the system is live. It's working. Yes, it continues to be refined, but it's in place, and I can invite John to maybe say a bit more about it as if Mr Lyle feels that would be helpful.
No, it's just to confirm that I'll cope. And as I say, I'm only talking what was on Twitter.
Yeah. Yeah, to confirm, it will
Mr.
cope.
Cook is nodding, so perhaps Mr. Cook would like to speak for the record. Just
No, I'm happy to. The system went live on 1st of July, and that was the plan. So it did actually go live on time. After the migration, there were some issues with the functionality. That's true. It hasn't worked as smoothly as we'd have liked. To sort of mitigate that issue, we agreed to carry out some of the work for the continuing money advisors on their behalf, so we're sort of doing stuff for them. We've now got 90% of the letters on, and we're working closely with payment distributors to make this process work. It's worth saying as well that nothing here stopped the debtors paying their payment distributors, so DAS debt payment programmes have continued to run as they always would. The issue was broadly about uploading information onto our new system. The new process we've got actually will reduce a significant amount of sort of manual effort from the payment distributors, so it's a much better solution moving forward. So we've made real progress there. We've got 3 releases planned by the 8th of October, and by that date we will be at steady state and the system will be delivering exactly what we said from the outset.
Many cases is it handling just now?
We've got a live load of about 12,500 cases at the moment.
What happened if you suddenly get 60,000?
Well, we've load tested it, so we can take loads more cases on it as things stand at the moment.
Can I say I'm very happy, I'm very pleased, having been involved in that business for 30 odd years, and you are doing what I've called for many years. Thank you very much.
I should say, Convener, although we have the capacity, we hope we will not have 60,000 more cases.
well, I suspect none of us can speculate as to the exact number. So we'll move on to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, last week I asked some specific questions about payment distributors, and I got the responses from Richard Dennis that I felt were a wee bit grey, and I hope you can maybe provide some clarification. As an example, Citizens Advice Scotland anticipates that there's going to be significant additional work as a result of supporting clients to choose a payment distributor. Now, the choice certainly is with the client, but advisors believe that they'll have to set out all the options and be transparent about any advantages and disadvantages in picking a particular provider, especially if there's an advantage to the, in this case, the CAB. What's your view on that?
I mean, this is a concern that I'm aware of as having been raised with the committee. There is no intent here to create an undue additional administrative burden. The idea that an advisor is going to have to sit there and talk through every possible available payment distributor is not something we intend, and clearly we will be laying that out in further guidance. That's not something we anticipate it will be a necessary part of the system. But I would urge the committee to consider right now, and the system, I'm not suggesting the system doesn't work just now, but right now we have a system whereby payment distributors are tendered for and then they're allocated on an individual basis for a specific debt payment programme by a computer algorithm. And when you're talking about, and this goes again back to the core of my point, Convener, around having a system that's actually designed around a specific individual person who is in vulnerable circumstances, who has debts they can no longer sustain, who we want to avoid going into a full insolvency situation so that they can benefit by the DAS scheme. We want to increase their autonomy, and there should be, I believe, some scope for them to have some form of say on the payment distributor if they want it. Now, that said, on a practical basis, I'm not sure how often that conversation will arise. I would imagine that a person will come through the proverbial or literal door to speak with an advisor who will talk through their options, who will say, yes, DAS is a possibility, this is how it works, and this is the payment distributor that we would recommend you use. I think most circumstances, the individual is going to say, well, that works for me, that sounds okay. But they should surely we believe that that individual, who's the person at the core of this process, should be entitled to have some form of say in the process. But in terms of it being an overly burdensome process, I don't believe it will be one.
Practically speaking, when the debtor is sitting in front of the money advisor, do you really think that they are well equipped to make a choice, make an informed choice? Because usually at that point, I mean, they're fairly desperate. They'll probably just go for anything that's suggested to them. Do they have the capacity to make that evaluation?
Well, that's a very difficult thing to say, because we're talking about a wide range of individuals with different life experience. I suspect in many circumstances you're probably correct insofar as to say is they'll have limited information, and that's where they need to strike up a good accord with the advisor who can talk through the options with them. But I don't think we should say that it'll be impossible for an individual to say, well, I am aware of these organisations and I happen to have a particular view on the organisation you are proffering as the payment distributor. Now, that does go back, because there's also autonomy here for the organisation offering advice as well. They could ultimately say, well, that's who we use. But at the end of the day, I think it is very important that we ensure that an individual person in vulnerable circumstances has as much autonomy as possible through this process.
Could any concerns about this be quite simply addressed by automatically allocating free sector cases to the accountant in bankruptcy?
It could be. I don't think we need to do that automatically at a point of law. I think that's very much down to individual organisations. So I'm not going to posit a specific example, because that then gets out there that I'm suggesting that organisation would want to do it. But let's say there is an individual citizens advice bureau. I'm not going to name a specific one, because ultimately they will have to make a determination. If they decided, for instance, that actually we want to use the accountant in bankruptcy, then that's their choice, that's their determination, and they can do that. And as it was very clear in response to Mr Lyle's question, the accountant in bankruptcy will do that and is very well equipped to do that. I don't think there's any necessity to say that should be the automatic assumption in every case.
Just something that's come up in the course of the committee's evidence taking. There's been many references to protected trust deeds, and I would just ask, is the Minister considering taking some action on the, frankly, rip-off charges that protected trust deeds seem to attract?
Well, I better be careful what I say in relation to the last point you make, Ms Beattie, because protected trustees are a legitimate part of the system. What I can say is we have heard some concern that there isn't the same incentive for organisations in the system to offer DAS, the Debt Arrangement Scheme, as there is the protected trust deeds element of the system, which might be why I've got these regulations before you here and now. So these regulations are in themselves one part of the response to the questions or the underlying assumption inherent in your question. Of course, we have also consulted recently on protected trust deeds, and arising out of that, we'll need to consider whether any other form of refinement of the system will be necessary. So, you know, everything we're doing isn't happening in isolation from our consideration of the wider system. But these regulations, in of themselves, are a response to the concern that you have outlined, Mr. Beattie. And I suppose to make the fundamental point, you know, where you look at the caseload in the system in 2017-18, I don't have the precise figures, but there were roughly around just over 2,000 new DAS cases and just approaching 6,000 protected trust deed cases. There does seem to be a bit of a disparity there. And then when you look at the creditor element of it, the disparity is somewhat brought into sharp focus that despite there being nearly 3 times as many protected trust deeds, for creditors through the debt arrangement scheme, there was just under £35 million returned. Through protected trust deeds, where there were nearly 3 times as many, there was a lesser sum returned, something like £22 million. So there's also the significant potential, not only for the benefit to debtors through these regulations, but also creditors as well.
I think Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Minister, thank you for your explanation and your legal advisor's explanation earlier on the points raised by the committee in their letter. And I, for one, am satisfied with the explanations that you offered to the committee. But what I'd like to ask you about, and you focused on the issue is about debtors and how we look after debtors. Could I just ask you a simple question about how, if the regulations are passed and approved, how we plan to roll this out so that the public are made fully aware of the changes, so that debtors and creditors can benefit from the regulations that you'll propose? Because it's a very difficult subject and it's difficult to get, some of the technicalities are difficult to get across. How do we plan to make that?
I actually think we're more or less set to go on that basis, Mr. Coffey, because the sector is aware of these regulations. They are, I think, given the response to consultation, very firmly and clearly and overwhelmingly in favour of the changes, so they will be ready for them to come into effect and to operate on that basis. So when people come through the door, that they're better placed to say, well, the debt arrangement scheme is the one that's going to benefit you most, and that involves you becoming insolvent, having to go through one of the other solutions that are available. So we're ready to hit the ground running, essentially, once these regulations are in place.
It can be effective almost immediately.
Now, there's probably a bit of a lead-in time. I'm going to ask John to remind me what that will be.
Yeah, well, the regs are going to come into force, thinking is the 4th of November. And at that point in time, any new application would be dealt with under the new regulations. So that takes time for a debt payment programme to be proposed and agreed. But within 5-6 weeks, we'll start to see cases coming through under the new regulations.
Super. Thank you.
I think on subjects not already covered, Andy Whiteman and Jackie Bailey may have further questions.
Yeah, just a further question, Minister. Some witnesses suggested that the new fee structure should be applied to existing cases. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, I think it would be technically possible, but I'm not convinced that it would necessarily be the right thing to do. I go back to the fundamental point I've made a couple of times now, Mr. Whiteman, in that that's a very specific policy proposition, one that hasn't been raised throughout the wider consideration of developing these regulations. So some of the consequences thereof probably haven't been fully thought through, although I can touch on what some of them might be. And we've not consulted on it. So again, it's not something I'd be inclined to do, to essentially make policy on the hoof. It's something I think we would need to to look at and consult with people on before we brought it forward as a serious proposition. There are probably some issues involved because essentially it would likely to have to involve the revocation of the existing programme that an individual has in place. Thereupon, and I'll maybe ask John to speak about this from his professional experience a little more because he could probably explain it in greater detail than I can. But thereupon, creditors could interact to actually demand some of the sums that they were hitherto not expecting to get back, to ask for them. There's no guarantee that the new programme could be agreed to, so the individual might fall out of the DAS system together. And of course, the individual's financial circumstances could have changed, so you could find they have to make a higher contribution. Notwithstanding the fees would fall by the wayside. So these are some of the things that probably haven't been fully thought through. Certainly on the face of it, it seems a very straightforward proposition. Well, you've got a new system, so let's just apply it retrospectively. Everyone will benefit by it. I'm not convinced it would be quite as straightforward as that. And again, I can't emphasise enough, we've not consulted on it, and I don't think Parliament expects the government to come forward with a very specific proposition like that without having spoken with people about it. And again, to do so would take some significant period of time. I would suggest quite a bit beyond the 4th of November when we hope to have these regulations live and people benefiting by them. John, I don't know if you want to talk about any of the specific elements there.
Just maybe a quick point, Minister. What people have been suggesting is if the regulations are passed without this provision being backdated, that some people would apply to just have their debt payment programme revoked and sort of reapply. And that is fraught with risk because potentially by doing that you could be charged fees and charges by your creditors. Creditors may also refuse your new proposal. And impact on creditors here I think is one where essentially this would move the goalposts for creditors, and we haven't consulted on that, as the Minister has said.
Okay, thank you.
Jackie Bailey.
Yeah, you've spoken about the wider review that the committee is certainly very keen on. Could you tell me when that's likely to happen? Because my understanding was that you'd said that we couldn't look at any regulations in respect of protected trust deeds until the next Scottish Parliament.
In terms of the wider review, I've not got a specific timescale, Ms. Bailey, and I recognise that it's not entirely helpful, but my commitment is to do it as soon as possible. In terms of the protected trust deeds, I'm not quite sure the point you're making in terms of if we were to do anything by, we could probably do things by secondary regulation, secondary legislation, by regulation. I think it's very unlikely we could do anything arising out of any element of review in primary legislation at this side of the parliamentary term.
Okay.
I think we just don't have the time.
Because you're right, that is important context to what we're discussing just now. You'll be aware of some of the very early evidence that we had that talked about a crisis in the free money advice sector, and I think the description was an unprecedented funding crisis. DAS is only one part of this, I acknowledge that. Can you outline what work the Scottish Government is doing to address that funding crisis, and by when?
I can, and you're right to say, these... I can understand why the issues become conflated with these regulations, and in some ways it's probably been by virtue of us saying that the IB will give funding back to the free advice sector that it's become such a focus of these regulations. It was never intended to be. But there is a wider piece of work underway. We have established, in 2018, we established the Tackling Problem Debt Group, which brought together a range of stakeholders to look at some of the issues around how we put debt advice on a sustainable footing. It's very important we do that because they are a critical element of not just the system here, but in providing assistance to a range of individuals who come through the door each and every day on a much wider basis than just the debt arrangement scheme, or indeed any form of debt solution that the EIB offer. It could be nothing to do with that. It could just be wider debt advice. And I think I set this out in, again, my letter before last, which was on the 9th of September, that we are publishing a debt route map based on the group's findings imminently. That will be available very shortly. I'd be very happy to come to discuss that matter with the committee at the time it is published. And indeed, in my last letter, I suggested that the type of proposition, as I understood it, was expressed in the last letter that you sent to me, could be part of our wider deliberations at that juncture.
Can I ask, I don't want to push too hard on this point, but does your debt route map set out a resolution to the financial crisis faced by the Money Advice Centre? Will it be accompanied by an announcement of money, to put it bluntly?
The debt route map will be accompanied by an announcement of the publication of the debt route map, and at that juncture you'll see what's included in it.
I was trying to invite you to resolve the problem for us.
God loves a trier, convener.
Okay, well let me keep trying, convener, if I might. My understanding is you had a stakeholder meeting last week.
Yes, I did.
About this issue. Step Change, Citizens Advice Scotland, Money Advisors, Carrington Dean even, all said they would support withdrawal of the regulations to allow Regulation 4 to be tweaked and to bring it back. Why won't you do that? Because that, in my view, is where the evidence certainly took people.
Well, it's certainly what you discussed as a committee, and I would readily concede that. I can't say anything other than go back to the fundamental point I made. I think the various and the specific elements of what have been asked, save for the point that Mr Whiteman has raised, which I'll address in a second, around what the IB might be doing, I don't think we can address them through... I'd withdraw the regulations, look at the matter and probably come to the conclusion that actually what's been asked we can't put in these regulations, which is why I'm referring to the fact that we've got the wider consideration around funding the free advice sector in particular. So I see no benefit in withdrawing the regulations on that basis. I'd withdraw them and not be able to accede to the request as I understood it. And I think I have understood it correctly in the sense of the letter that was sent and the other points that have been put to me. In relation to the very specific issue that Mr Whiteman raised, it's something that I think that we can look at, but I'm just not convinced that it merits a withdrawal of these regulations, given the very clear commitment that I am setting out publicly on the record, that the Accountant in Bankruptcy has set out on the record, that I've put in writing to this committee, the information of which will be fully available through the Accountant in Bankruptcy's accounting process, that the money that is ingathered by the Accountant in Bankruptcy, the only element that will be retained by Accountant in Bankruptcy is for administrative purposes, and 15% of the 20% at least, or 75% of the funds that they ingather will go back to the free advice sector. That's on the record. Now, if it's felt useful some point down the line to put that on a statutory basis, I'm willing to do that. I don't think that necessitates withdrawal of these regulations here and now.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question. I wonder if I might put this to John Cook. My understanding of the kind of the haste in which the regulations were laid, particularly in relation to Regulation 4, because though the Minister and I disagreed on consultation, the sector have said that they didn't get sufficient consultation on Regulation 4, that actually it has something to do with the tenders for the existing payment distributors. Is their contract about to end? Are tenders due to be laid again? Is that what's driving the speed for this?
The contract for the payment distributors ended on 30th of June.
Okay.
So there's been a non-competitive action put in place to hopefully allow the regulations to be put in place. I think it would have been neat if we were able to have done the regulations, had them in place for then.
Sure. Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from committee members? If not, we will now move to the formal debate, assuming the Minister wishes to put his motion to the committee, which I think from his comments he was, and that's item 3 on the agenda.
I very much do. I move the motion in my name, Convener.
Now, I think we, first of all, then Thank you, Minister. And then we are, as it were, in the debate. So, do members have questions or points to put to the Minister in the debate? Richard Lyle.
I don't think it's a point. As I said before, in any change it's always suggested that we're not going far enough or have done enough consultation. In this proposal, since I joined this committee last week, I haven't had the full background of FIMI, but in what I've witnessed in the last couple of weeks, unfair charges are now being removed. Debtors are now being helped to repay their debt quicker. People who are in debt, they're in despair. They're in despair. And you know, the point was made earlier, who do they go to? Now they can go to people like Citizen Advice, get that advice, don't need to pay a penny, and get their debts paid quicker. We're handing them a lifeline to repay sooner, and I thank the Minister for that. What I've witnessed today, I've been very impressed with the comments that you've made and the way that you're handling this. Yes, you can consult on other things, but that's for another day. To withdraw something that now I feel is wrong, and basically I will totally support these proposals based on my previous employment experience. This is something I've wished for quite a long time. I think it's fairness for people in debt, and I support the motion. Convener.
I take it the Minister will agree with the committee members' comments.
Thus far.
Thus far. And I think it is important to record that as the points highlighted, obviously I think I and others in the committee are equally pleased with the positive aspects of the regulations, but unfortunately, certainly I'm not persuaded on the issue that has been raised about the regulation formatter, which did seem to matter to those involved in at the coalface, as it were. I do accept the law is not always clear and there may be different ways of interpreting it, but I'm not persuaded at this stage on that point, and also the point made about the regulations having been laid before the consultation concluded, and therefore, you know, it does seem there is a wider consultation that needs to be carried out here. I'm happy for the Minister to briefly repeat his responses to those points to the record if he wishes to, or we'll come to another committee member.
Well, okay. In relation to the point you raise, Convener, I mean, I can't emphasise enough that what is being requested is not something that I think will be possible to do. So if these regulations are to fall today, we would certainly take away and look at them, but I just don't see them coming back in any other substantially altered shape than they are in just now. And in relation to the point you make about the consultation not having been complete before, again, I have to emphasise the consultation about the regulations was done in advance of these regulations. The very limited consultation that was undertaken was merely and only and restricted entirely as to how the funds that were gathered, or ingathered is the technical term, by the accountant in bankruptcy for the limited number of cases they are handling would be redistributed back to the free advice sector. That's all it was about. That's the only thing it was about. And if we are to believe that fundamentally alters the nature of these regulations, then I think that is wrong. These regulations are designed about making the debt arrangement scheme more accessible for the debtor out there, more transparent and clear. As Mr. Lyle has alluded to, there are charges that are often levied for individuals entering this scheme beyond what they are obliged to repay under the assessment undertaking. I won't say that they're necessarily all unfair. Whether they're fair or unfair, the charges can often exist. This is a scheme that's designed around the individual. The consultation that you referred to happening after was not about the regulations per se. It was about one very specific commitment that the accountant in bankruptcy has made that we didn't need to make, incidentally. could have said, no, actually, accountant bankruptcy is just going to keep all that funding and it'll just be gathered up for the utilisation of accountant bankruptcy. So would the committee have rather that is what we would have done, then there wouldn't have been a consultation and no one saying, well, there wasn't a consultation after. I cannot see how that can be a major bone of contention on whether or not these regulations should or should not be passed.
Any other committee members? Jackie Bailey.
Yeah, I think it's important to set this in context. And what I've heard today, perfectly reasonably, but nevertheless is the case, that a more fundamental review of not just the debt arrangement scheme, but indeed all the kind of debt system, if you like, is some way off. And equally in terms of money that's available, it's not necessarily, although I tried to invite the Minister to tell us, is not necessarily the case that those problems will be resolved. And I think that's why we're facing such an urgent situation, is that the funding crisis described to us by the witnesses is something that they are very concerned about. So in that context, let me say I've also provided money advice in the past. So I do know a little bit about the system. And let me say the changes to the schemes in terms of the rest of the regulations are very welcome indeed. And I don't think anybody has given evidence to the contrary. But it is about Regulation 4 that we've taken most of the evidence about. And let me run the risk of sending the Minister off the deep end again about consultation, because whilst Regulation 4 talks about the 20% split, and he would be absolutely right to say that people were quite content with that figure, it is the case that in discussions, money advisors, time after time, the free advice sector, asked the accountant in bankruptcy, how would this be distributed? How would it be paid? So that they understood the system. The regulations were laid before that was addressed, and the consultation happened whilst the regulations were before the committee. That is the point that everybody would acknowledge isn't ideal. I recognise that the fact that the existing payment distributors were out of the contract period may have had something to do with it, and I acknowledge that. But it strikes me that everywhere else where you've had those detailed conversations with the sector, you've come to great positions in terms of the rest of the regulations. It's a shame you didn't complete that conversation here, otherwise we probably wouldn't be having this discussion just now. So I take the point the Minister is absolutely right to say he values the money advice sector. If you value it, it's something you need to resource. And I think this was a missed opportunity in terms of the regulations. Wanting to be pragmatic as ever, I acknowledge the problems raised with about the IT system and John Cook's response, but functionality remains a problem. It's 90% fixed, it's not 100% fixed. There is time to actually withdraw these regulations and get it right. And as the Minister prides himself on listening to the sector, they are saying, withdraw and fix this, because we can do better than is currently before us. Now, I regret that we've come to this point. I know there are civil servants who will watch committee meetings and will be telling the Minister and the AIB what's going on. You could have picked this up earlier, and I regret we're sitting here. That is a matter, I think, of regret for us all, because it could be fixed earlier. But I do think you can make regulations in respect of the fees. Section 7Y, which was inserted to allow the AIB to charge 2%, could be used to make similar provision for the free money advice sector, and I think it's been a lost opportunity.
On that latter point, I take an alternative view. I think Victoria's laid that out, and I know she can't speak right now, but I think she's laid that out very clearly in terms of our interpretation of regulations. Again, though, this goes back to the fundamental point of these regulations. So Ms Bailey has talked about the concerns that the free money advice sector has about their sustainability and the funding that they need to continue their good work. I've heard that as well, and I've made the point about how we're looking at that as a separate piece of work. I think Richard Dennis made the point very well, though, that we're not talking huge sums that are going to be realised for the free advice sector through what has been laid out with accountant bankruptcy as a bonus, for want of a better term, arising out of these regulations. It is not a core part of these regulations. You're talking, I think, something that the estimate is potentially £100,000 out of the first year of the operation will be available from the account in bankruptcy, acting as a payment distributor, going back to the money advice sector. That's additionality. If I was to say, if Ms Bailey wants that to be the proposition for me to say to if she wants that to be my announcement with the tackling debt roadmap, that, well, there you go, there's that £100,000 through this mechanism for the free advice sector. I think the free advice sector are going to have something to say about that. So, the commitment here has been laid out, it's been made in good faith, it's on the public record, the information will be publicly available, and I have, as I've set out, quite willing to come back and consider, I don't think it's necessary, but if it is something that the committee wants to explore subsequent to the passing of these regulations about putting the AIB element of the payment distributor function and returning funds to the free advice sector on a statutory footing, then we can look at that. But that does not necessitate these regulations falling today. These regulations fall today. We are delaying the implementation of a system that is designed to benefit vulnerable individuals across the country. I would urge the committee to think very clearly about that point, rather than some of the details that have been raised around the money that will be gathered by the accounting bankruptcy being handed back to the free advice sector. We've said what we'll do there. That's been laid out, but that's not the core part, the core element of these regulations. It was never intended to be.
First of all, Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Convener. Putting the funding issue to one side, I agree with Jackie that these regulations are very welcome indeed. And we talked about listening to the sector on the evidence of the 3rd of September, looking through the comments that were made. Money Advice Scotland said they are certainly a step in the right direction. Step change, the regulations will benefit clients and help them when they are in difficulty. CAB said they're a step in the right direction, and Inverclyde Council said, in answer to a question you put yourself, Convener, as I said in my submission, it is not my preference, but I will take anything I get. So I would like to say that in the round, I think we should be supporting these regulations. Dick Lyle has highlighted the benefits to creditors and the benefits to debtors, and we maybe should be doing a piece of work in future looking at the debt situation overall, but I don't think we should hold up these regulations for the reasons that were given both by the sector and also by Dick Lyle this morning.
I mean, I would agree with Mr MacDonald. I think the idea that the sector doesn't support these regulations is not borne out by the significant weight of evidence in response to the consultation that we undertook, and I think the response that was given to the committee. My estimation of what you were told by your witnesses was that on balance they favour these regulations. On that basis, I hope the committee will too.
Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much. Convener, just on a technical point to begin with, of course, the committee doesn't vote whether these regulations fall or pass. They make a recommendation to Parliament, which will make its view clear. Earlier in the debate, or it might have been the evidence session, Deputy Convener Willie Coffey said he was satisfied with the explanation that the Minister had given. But in response to the Convener in the debate, the Minister again took a meaning from what we were asking. I don't think was the meaning we had ever intended to give. That's unfortunate, and I realise, of course, the process of secondary legislation is one where it's kind of take it or leave it. Obviously in correspondence at the last minute or whatever, some misunderstandings might arise. But I think it's clear to the Minister now where the concerns over Regulation 4 have arisen from. I'm glad that the Minister earlier in evidence did in fact confirm that any statutory provision either for a fee to the money advice sector in general for any work they do on DAS, or indeed to provide a statutory underpinning to the 15% from AIB could be included in these regulations under Section 7 2 UB. The Minister made the argument that he's not enthusiastic about that. He doesn't see the need for delay in order to secure these regulations. I remain concerned that the regulations do not provide for that when they could, because it's quite clear that the free money advice sector is under some stress. So I'm rather surprised that in the deliberations and the consultation that took place in these regulations, that particular issue didn't come to the attention of the AIB or ministers in a more forceful way than it appears to have. And perhaps that is because the focus of the consultation was in widening access to DAS and looking at incentives for the private sector, etc. In all the circumstances, I'm content to vote for these, to recommend Parliament does agree with these regulations, but I do so with some reluctance, because I do think an opportunity has been missed here, and it is a fine judgment as to whether we should vote to recommend Parliament rejects these or not, on the basis that the Minister might withdraw them and reconsider that element of Regulation 4. And given the assurances he's given on the public record about the AIB and the 15%, and given the arguments that were put to us by the accountant bankruptcy last week and himself today about the private sector payment distributors, I'm content to let us wait and see how that plays out. But I would stress to the Minister that the free money advice sector is under considerable stress. A new funding regime has been put in place, a new source of funding has been put in place, and there are no guarantees that the free money advice sector will be able to obtain any portion of that. That remains a concern of mine. I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm that he also shares that concern, and is indeed, as he said earlier, willing to look at this again if it proves necessary.
On the latter point, absolutely, of course. I mean, I don't want to do anything other than put in legislation that's going to work on an effective basis. That's what I want to do, and that's what I think we have here. But yes, of course, we have to keep these things under review and learn from practical experience. So yes, that is my clear commitment. In terms of this goes back to the point I've tried to make a couple of times, there is obviously, and there has to be, a wider discussion about how we sustain and support the free advice sector. I've alluded, well, I've not even alluded, I've been explicit in terms of the route map that we're taking forward, arising out of the working group that's been looking at these matters. And I think that's the appropriate place, because yes, this is an opportunity to realise some additional funding for the free advice sector. That opportunity will be realised by the commitment we've made, but it was never going to be the solution in its entirety. So that requires a wider piece of work, and that work is underway. But I welcome the comments made by Mr Whiteman, not least in reminding me that he is correct. Of course, there's a recommendation to Parliament as a whole. I welcome the spirit in which he has set them out. I am utterly sincere in the point I'm making when we will keep these things under review, we will look at them, and we will be informed by practical experience and return to them as necessary.
Any further questions or points from committee members? Do you have a brief point, Mr. Law? You made some points
I would like
on.
to. How many citizen advice bureaus are there in Scotland, Minister? Do you know?
No, I have been told, but isn't coming to
my view
recollection immediately, Mr. Lyle.
Well, having previously been a councillor, a man of many talents, there are 32 councils. On average, some councils may have 2 or 3, or even possibly 4. So £100,000, I think, won't be a big royalties check coming to them. You know, they might get an average of between £1,000 or £2,000 a year. But if we allow this system to go through today, that could arise, and if people like me encourage the Citizen Advice Bureau to direct all the work towards you guys, that cheque will get bigger. So basically, as far as I'm concerned, you know, what we do today will help people tomorrow, and if we don't pass this today, we'll be letting debtors down.
Well,
Mr. Lyle is making the same point about referring to his many talents and also confirming his support of this particular draft regulation, Minister. So I think you've already confirmed your agreement with both of, or at least one of those propositions.
I agree that Mr. Lyle is a man of many talents, Convener.
Well, perhaps we can move on. Are there any further final points from committee members? Jackie Bailey.
And I appreciate that Victoria Morton can't respond in this section of the debate, but she did agree to go away and look at section 7Y, as I requested, as being a possible mechanism by which you could make that payment. On that basis, I would invite the Minister to withdraw, to allow that to happen, and then to find the vehicle to be able to fix the regulations and then bring them back from in front of the committee. If he's not prepared to do that, then I regret I won't be voting to recommend passing these regulations.
I have to set out and be clear to the committee, Convener, I do not intend to withdraw these regulations for the myriad reasons I have set out, not least amongst them, I'm not convinced that we can achieve what has been sought by the committee through withdrawing them and looking at it again. And secondly, some of the very specific propositions have not been fully consulted upon. So it is with regret that I will not be able to secure Ms Bailey's support, clearly.
The Minister is not withdrawing his motion, and I think therefore we're at the stage we will move to a vote on the motion. So first of all, the question is that motion S5M 17827 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. In that case, we'll move to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? There will be, in that event, no abstentions, and the motion is accordingly agreed to by the committee. I will invite... Yes, I think I'll invite the committee to agree that I, as convener, and the clerk produce a short factual report of the committee's decisions and arrange to have it published in that event. Are we agreed? Very well. Thank you to the Minister and Victoria Morton and John Cook for coming in today. We will now move, I will suspend briefly and we'll move to item 4 on the agenda after that. We continue now with item 4 on pre-budget scrutiny, and may I welcome our witnesses today. First of all, Matt Lancashire, to my left, Director of Policy and Public Affairs at SCDI, Helen Martin, Assistant General Secretary at the Scottish Trades Union Congress, Richard Marsh, Director of FOR Consulting, and Tony Mackay, Economist of Mackay Consultants. Welcome to all of you today. If I might start with a fairly general question, and then we'll move on to questions from other members of the committee. And for those who may not have appeared before, no need to press any buttons. The system will be operated from the sound desk. Simply indicate you wish to come in if you've not been brought in by raising your hand, and I will seek to bring you in at that point. The objective of RSA is to reduce regional labour market inequalities. Now, I want to have views from the panel on whether or not that is being achieved. Who would like to speak to that first of all? Richard Marsh, you're smiling. You weren't nodding, but you're at least smiling. Do you have a comment to make on that?
I was actually looking to Helen first to go on that. The general point, I think, that has been raised in submissions is that we still have quite significant regional inequalities in Scotland. RSA is only one tool that you'd use to try and tackle those inequalities. But we need to measure what RSA is doing far better than we do currently. So we've highlighted in the submissions where RSA has been used to help companies invest, and we report the jobs that are going to be safeguarded or created, but we don't measure consistently over time just how many jobs are sustained over the long term, over the life of the company in different parts of Scotland.
All right, and do others have a follow-up on that or comment on that? Matt Lancashire.
Yeah, sure. I think what you're asking is, has it gone far enough in addressing regional disparities going forward? And I suspect, and the evidence that we found is that funding does continue to be dominated, I struggle to say that word, dominated across the central belt. So if you look to regions in the south of Scotland and further afield, there is less funding applications as such from those types of businesses within the actual grant fund itself. And I think there is a regional disparity in terms of how the fund has been potentially awarded in the past from the evidence that we've had back from members.
Anyone else have a comment on the regional aspect or the relationship to employment? No. In that case, we'll move now to a question from Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thanks very much, Kavita. Good morning to the panel. Can I just go actually on that? I mean, firstly, I mean, what do you think that can be done to address that, I don't want to say regional bias, but that focus perhaps on the central belt, as Matt Lancashire mentioned? And also a more general point, what do you think the awareness within businesses of the RSA? Do you think it's, and are there particular areas, either regionally or within different sectors, or sizes of business or the like, that perhaps aren't as aware of RSA and therefore not able to access it perhaps as they should do?
Yeah, I think awareness is sporadic depending on what type of business you are and where you're located. I think increasing awareness of any type of grant program, but particularly RSA, could be beneficial because then it allows an option and a choice if you're a business leader to suggest whether this is a useful fund to support your capital expenditure as such going forward. But I also think there's a little bit back from business as well to be aware of these types of things, and I think it takes good leadership and management within businesses to understand that these options are open and available too. So it goes two ways in my view, and perhaps there's more on how we support and educate our business leaders going forward about making the right decisions for their business, whether it's with this grant fund or other aspects of their business too, particularly when you're looking at securing jobs or increasing the GDP of a certain region as well.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
Could I just add briefly, the session you had on RSA from the enterprise networks talked a little bit about trying to stimulate the demand for RSA. And previously this committee was quite critical of investment funds that have had very low uptake. And we've had similar conversations around the National Investment Bank around stimulating demand for the products you're going to have. I think awareness of these products is one thing. Whether you have the right products to fit the needs of those businesses is another. And we need to give as much attention to that as are these businesses aware of what you got? Or maybe what you have isn't what they need.
I think that's a good point. I understand. I think one of my colleagues is going to cover demand stimulation anyway as an area. So, can I go look at another point? We've looked at looking at kind of which regions and sectors have benefited so far. I mean, we've talked obviously about the geographical side on the regions, but I was just wondering if there are particular sectors that have benefited, and also as the focus perhaps on which sectors are successful or which of the growing sectors, such as perhaps automation in the future, how can and how should and will RSA be able to develop to accommodate those changing sectors? Happy for anyone to take that.
Okay. I think personally that the RSA system has been, very successful in Scotland. I think that it's important for the committee to distinguish between RSA and the other selective assistance that Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise are providing. And from an economic point of view, you could regard the former as being reactive and the latter as being proactive. And I think that, the biggest disappointment in the last, say, 5 years has been on the proactive side rather than the RSA. So if the economy is doing well, businesses are going to go to SE and HIE and ask for assistance, and they will get it through RSA. The economy has struggled in the last, say 5 years for various reasons, and it's the proactive activities and proactive expenditure of SE and HIE that I think has been disappointing rather than the RSA expenditure.
Okay, thank you.
All right, move now to Andy Whiteman.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm just wondering where the panel think that the RSA funding is doing a great deal to support the government's policy of fair work and inclusive growth. So, for example, there's been little change in the National Performance Framework, business and fair work outcomes, the 8 elements of that over the past years. Now, maybe RSA is too small a component of broad government support to be expected to have any direct impact on that, indeed whether we can even measure it. But nevertheless, I'd be interested in the any views the witnesses have about that.
Yes, I think it's it probably hasn't been targeted along a fair work line until fairly recently. I think so that the change in approach from Scottish Enterprise that was only came in April 2019 is quite welcome. But I don't think it's being necessarily targeted in a way that was designed to support fair work outcomes. It was designed to perhaps support employment, but there wasn't much focus given to what type of employment or what quality of employment or what some of them maybe the knock-on impacts of certain employers versus other employers might be on the wider economy. But I think the focus has changed. I think whether or not that amounts to a substantive change that feeds through into the national performance indicators, I think is quite a tall order, but it is something that we need to start focusing on in a whole range of business subsidies and a whole range of work that we do in order to start to try to get those indicators moving in a positive fashion, because I think it is true that at present none of the national performance framework indicators around business and fair work are moving positively. They're either holding steady or declining. So I think we do have quite a lot of work to do, and I think every subsidy has to play its role in that, but we're very much at the beginning of the journey.
Is it even possible that a funding stream like regional selective assistance can substantially support fair work in particular, given that you know, Amazon is one of the companies that received RSA, and the arguments that were made to rebut accusations that this wasn't an appropriate use of RSA were that this was essentially a competitive process whereby companies like Amazon or any others in many instances would be looking at a variety of locations in which they might expand their existing footprint or indeed develop new facilities. And the RSA could make the difference between that happening from a Scottish Government point of view, Scottish enterprise point of view in Scotland, vis-a-vis, for example, the north of England. Now, in those circumstances, it's hard to see how you can do much to promote fair work when the dominant driver is essentially a competitive driver to try and provide more of an incentive than might be available in other parts of the UK. Is that fair? Or?
Well, I mean, sorry, am I?
Yes.
I think the key point here is, well, what are the values that you're trying to promote? I mean, is it appropriate to put Scottish Government funding, public money, into bringing a company to Scotland that has unfair work outcomes? And that is actually, it's a challenging question. There are difficult answers to be given here, because there was a key example with Amazon as a company that was in receipt of government funds, but was clearly not meeting the principles of fair work. But it is possible to put these into to funding like RSA. It just might mean that we have to change our mindset on what it is that we want to see within our economy and the sorts of conversations that we're prepared to have with businesses. And you might find that actually Amazon are willing to have these conversations. And I think this is why also the STUC has argued quite strongly that there needs to be a greater focus on collective bargaining within this structure as well, because I think you can sometimes see perverse outcomes within these sorts of fair work discussions as well. So companies might say, yes, we'll pay the living wage, but then they take it away from their employees in a different way. So I think that's what Amazon did in the end. They agreed to pay the living wage, but then they removed other subsidies for their workforce. So it was kind of a zero-sum game. Whereas if you have collective bargaining coverage, then the workforce gets more of a say of how their work is organised, how it is run, and that means that you get better long-term kind of fair work outcomes. So we would see the collective bargaining coverage element of the National Performance Framework indicators as a key sort of indicator of how well we're pushing out fair work within Scotland, because it gives the workforce the ability to shape the work, and it gives employers and workers in a sector the ability to make tools that fit that sector rather than simply kind of very sort of blunt instruments that you can sometimes see in other ways.
And Matt Lancashire wanted to come in on this point.
Just very briefly, I think we also have to remember, I think it supports Helen and it supports Tony's point, that RSA has had a positive impact on the Scottish economy. And importantly, it's been responsible for generating additional jobs in economic downturn. And I think it's the jobs in a sense that RSA is emphasised on achieving. I think once those jobs are here, it's how we shape those into fair work practices, fair work jobs, fair work roles as well. And I take Helen's points in particular about how we might go about doing that as part of the RSA process. But without the RSA, I think it's important to point those additional jobs wouldn't be in Scotland, and our economy and people, our unemployment rate might be worse potentially.
Richard Marsh.
Very briefly, I think both Helen and Matt are right. RSA has got the potential, if we chose to attach different wider conditions, to actually make more of an impact. I think Matt's quite right to point as well, the more conditions you attach, the less likely companies are to take you up on the intervention, and we have to balance it with it providing jobs in an area that perhaps needs it. And we have to be ourselves much clearer, and I fully agree with you, being very clear about what kind of development do we want. And at present, inclusive growth is ill-defined, and it's not fit to shape those policy discussions in Scotland.
I'm just wondering if I could put a brief follow-up on that, if Mr. Whiteman is happy with that, not to interrupt him in his line of questioning. I mean, you say if you put too many conditions on people, but if we take Amazon, for example, who locate warehouses where the goods need to be distributed, and then the further away from the delivery point the warehouse is, obviously that has an effect on the costs for Amazon. So I would have thought that there's a balancing from their point of view in terms of cost and profit, and it's not all on one side, as it were. So, I mean, they have advantages by using them as an example, by being located in Scotland and having operations, as other companies will. So I do take the point, but do you think that there is, it's not quite as simple as that? There's both sides. Helen Martin, I see you're nodding in agreement.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think sometimes we take these conversations to be quite blunt in some ways. We think that employers have a complete blank page about where they can take their business, but it's not entirely true. There are other reasons why they might want to locate in Scotland, and there are other things that Scotland have to offer. We have a very highly skilled workforce. We have good connectivity. We have high level. We have a good economy to build on, I think is what I'm trying to say. And there are reasons why companies want to come here to get access to our market as well. And I don't think we should start every conversation with the thought that we can't put fair work conditions on, that these things are not achievable, because actually they are achievable. And other countries do have better social frameworks around employment than we have here in the UK, and they're still very prosperous and very successful. So it is possible to work in a way that has greater social justice outcomes and still a really good business environment.
Didn't mean to take you out of your stride, Andy Whiteman, so hand back to you.
Straight back into it, the other issue that was raised by some witnesses was about the differential rates of support available in the different areas according to whether you're in a Tier 1 or Tier 2 assisted area, or whether in fact you're in the rest of Scotland effectively, which has got a subject to the general block exemption regulations. And Aberdeenshire Council, highlighted the fact in their evidence that they were the economic assessment in general of a place like Aberdeenshire, which is relatively more affluent than other parts of Scotland, can mask inequalities within Aberdeenshire. And they also highlighted the reassessment of the assisted areas that took place that has resulted in the situation whereby somewhere like Buckie, which is in Tier 2, can receive a higher rate of intervention than Macduff, I think, which is just across the river in Banff and Buchan area of Aberdeenshire. I mean, do we need to kind of revisit the kind of hard lines on maps that we have, given that the impact of businesses and their choice of where they're going to locate are dependent on things like workforce, transport, site and land availability, raw materials, all these kind of factors, and they don't fit neatly into the areas that we've defined on maps as being more or less deserving of support.
Richard Marsh.
Can I just make I suppose a point? Again, I agree with Helen. I mean, when we're looking at inward investment in particular, companies are unlikely to prioritise the availability of grants or loans fairly high. They'll look at the available workforce, the strategic location, and sourcing raw materials and so on. The only point that makes me slightly nervous about what you're suggesting is those hard lines are actually quite useful in that there can be sometimes very good reasons for supporting industries and companies, and other times the reasons, the long-term benefits for giving large support to industries and businesses is less than clear. And so there are quite good reasons why allowing the market to decide where the best places to invest might be, and allowing businesses to create their own innovative products and competitiveness is actually quite good, and we should assume that's probably the case for most. If we, having been involved in trying to kind of help shape some of these lines in the past, there's a bit of gamesmanship to try and remove the lines as much as you possibly can to the benefit of your local economy. So I think if we did move from hard lines, which I accept that there are good reasons for doing it, it might end up in gerrymandering, where the different assisted areas could be, and people will try and push those lines back as far as they can to make sure you can get investment in areas that might have got it anyway.
Right, Jackie Bailey.
Can I turn to the appraisal process? And I'm curious to know whether you think the RSA grant appraisal process is fit for purpose, given we've had some firms that have been in receipt of RSA funds that have subsequently gone on to experience, how can I put it, trading difficulties. You know, the list includes Michelin Tire Factory in Dundee, Kayam, the Two Sisters Poultry, Havelock, Bifab, and most recently Ferguson's Marine. And I wonder whether I could start with Tony Mackay.
Yes, I think, Jackie, we should accept that bodies like SE and HIE have to take risks. Okay, if they didn't invest in activities, not necessarily specific firms, but if they didn't invest in risky ventures, then you know anybody could do the job they're doing. So I think it's inevitable that some of the businesses that they assist will go under. I think we've got to accept that. There are some exceptions, and I think I've made this point to you before that I think in the last few years, in my opinion, both SE and Highlands and Islands Enterprise have started to take a lot of investment decisions on the basis of politics rather than business or economics. So I think that they've become too politically biased, and that's resulted in Ferguson Marine is an obvious example, Prestwick Airport, Burnt Island Fabricators. So I think unfortunately, in the last few years, quite a few of these RSA or other decisions have been taken more on political grounds than economic grounds. If they're taken on economic grounds, I'm not particularly worried. In fact, good isn't probably the correct phrase, but I mean, I think it's a good sign that some investments have gone wrong because it shows the bodies are taking risks. Okay, now it may be too high, but I think the big problem in the last few years has just been the political bias in the likes of Prestwick Airport and Ferguson Marine.
Some of the committee might disagree with you, but I'll not invite them to speak. I'm getting an indication from Helen Martin.
Yes, I think I would take maybe a slightly different view, and I would see it more as shoring up strategic assets within the Scottish economy, and I think that is something that is quite important to be done, and I think sometimes that is something that the role the government does have to play. I think it's important that there are still strong fair work dimensions around these issues. I think we would like to see conversations around how the workforce will be treated in the future by, particularly when new owners come in. I think that has to be a key element of the conversation. And one that doesn't always happen. It does sometimes. It doesn't always. It's patchy. We're still seeing kind of patchy coverage on that question, and we do obviously want to see a Scottish Government that's ready to defend, however, strategic assets that play an absolute essential role in shoring up elements of the economy that would otherwise perhaps not fare well if left to market forces alone.
Richard Marsh. Sorry.
Yeah, I think kind of probably, I was going to make a similar point to Helen and Tony, but I suppose when you're saying political, it's probably political with a small p, and I think probably Helen's definition of trying to shore up strategic assets is probably fair. So I think, as I mentioned before, in the letter from Scottish Enterprise to this committee, as to what they did with Kayam, I think that speaks quite loudly to that kind of approach. I think Scottish Enterprise were very clear that they tried to do everything they could to save a large employer in an area that desperately needed jobs. My concern there is, if you're using, if the intention is to try to shore up strategic assets, is an economic development tool that encourages people to go on a large-scale capital investment program and expand their workforce, is that the right thing to do to try and improve the viability of companies in distress? I can't imagine for 1 minute it is. So we're not using the right tool to try and achieve what I think Scottish Enterprise are actually trying to do, but are not saying so in their correspondence with you.
Matt Lancaster.
Yeah, but just very briefly, I don't disagree with what's been suggested. I think around these businesses that we're calling strategic assets, we need to look wider than RSA, and I think this plays to Richard's point about how you make them wealth creators, and whether that's Prestwick Airport or other firms in the future. How do you go beyond just shoring them up? How do you go beyond then accepting risks from these types of organisations to create wealth on perhaps bidding for other contracts, perhaps, you know, supporting out with their current region, looking beyond the opportunity of just shoring the business up. And I think that takes, again, going back to increased leadership and management within these businesses to look broader beyond where we are right now. And I think that's quite critical if we're going to get the best out of actually RSA. It shows up a business, but what next?
Okay.
And what's the opportunity to go further?
Well, what's interesting from my perspective is that there was a decline in RSA, particularly around about 2014 when there were changes to state aid rules. That's gone up in the last year, but it's not large firms, it's smaller firms. And having spent part of my time yesterday with a firm in receipt of RSA, a small firm, the volume of material both in the application process and the subsequent monitoring is quite vast. Richard, you said it's not the right tool and we need to be brave to move away from it. What would you move to? What do you think? Why should we continue to spend money on RSA, or do you think we should direct money into another area?
Can I, my suggestion would be to go back to what you said originally. And I think you said something along the lines of these firms receive RSA and then subsequently find themselves in trouble later on. I don't think that's the right timeline. In all of the cases you suggested, and many others, very large employers, they're in trouble first, then they receive RSA. If what we're doing is trying to find very large employers who are encountering difficulties, then we actually have tools already in Scotland that help engage with corporates who are facing significant challenges in turnaround type activities. But that's very different from providing direct funding to produce capital investment and expanding your workforce, which again seems to be a very brave decision to do if you have a company that's possibly facing cash flow problems.
Any other views on whether we should replace RSA with something else or use it differently? No? Helen?
I mean, I think the role of RSA is important. I do have some sympathy about the timing when it is used and how it is used. I think what we have seen in Scotland recently, and there's a whole list of companies named, are moments of crisis where we are trying to deal with a company that is very much a strategic asset in the economy. If you think of Ferguson's Marine, for example, it's playing an absolutely essential role in shipbuilding, and there is a whole list of shipbuilding procurement coming behind from ports all across Scotland, and we have need for this type of company, so it is absolutely right to shore it up. And I think what we've seen is enterprise agencies and the Scottish Government using every tool in their armoury to do so, and I think perhaps it might be fair to think about whether or not we need specific tools for those interventions, rather than trying to simply make what's there kind of fit, because actually we think that, you know, using state intervention to ensure that strategic assets have a life and can be maintained for the value of the Scottish economy is reasonable and responsible government, and therefore thinking about how you do that and planning for that in a systematic way is perfectly reasonable, rather than simply looking at what can we give people access to, what stick and plaster can we put on today. And I think that could be an approach that could potentially play a large role in a sort of industrial strategy within Scotland.
Tony Mackay?
Let me just give one example that I've been heavily involved with for many years. I don't know if many of the committee were alive in the 60s and 70s, but we had but I can remember that at the height of the North Sea oil boom, we had about 15,000 people working in the fabrication industry in the Highlands and Islands, Naig, Ardesseer, Kishon, Methil, Hunterston. And we did something like 70% or 65% share of the UK market. The fabrication work was done in the UK, mainly in Scotland, 67%. There was a body called the Offshore Supplies Office that was very active in those days. Now the share is about 10%. Okay, it's collapsed, and instead of 15,000 jobs, we've 500, 600 jobs in the fabrication industry, and yet there's the offshore wind farms. Virtually all the fabrication for the offshore wind farms is being done overseas, even in high-cost countries like Denmark and Norway. Decommissioning of the oil and gas installations, that's a big industry and will be a big industry in Scotland for the next 20 years. Our share of that is about 10%. Most of the equipment that's been removed from the North Sea is being taken overseas. Okay, so I think the bodies like Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Island Enterprise should be doing much more, okay, to get the 10% share up to what it was in the 70s and 80s, and they're not doing that. Okay, and whether RSA is the best way, I doubt it, but I'd certainly like to see Scottish Enterprise and HIE doing much more to resurrect the fabrication industry in Scotland.
Okay, that was a useful example. Thank you.
Pardon me, speaking of that useful example, Tony Mackay, it's always easy to obviously, critique or criticise things, but what specifically should they be doing to accomplish what you've just set out?
Well, I could give, quite a lot of examples. Wave energy. Mr. Salmond, I think, a few years ago said that Scotland would be the Saudi Arabia of wave energy. And yet, it's on a tiny scale. HIE have lost about £20 million on investing in two companies that went bust. They've set up a body of Wave Energy Scotland, which is, doing very, very little. So I think there need to be you know, serious changes at the top level in both organisations. And we need to be coming up with a development strategy for helping marine energy, for helping the fabrication industry. And possibly, if there's a contract for an offshore wind farm, there should be some conditions applied to that that say that there's got to be a certain level of Scottish content, maybe not 70%. Now, if there is a condition and that the companies getting the contracts for the offshore wind farms have to abide by that, then SE and HIE should be helping local businesses win those contracts. And they're not doing that, unfortunately.
Right, I'll turn to Colin Beattie now.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to look at the economic impact of RSA, which seems, according to the information I've got, to be rather difficult to pin down in actuality. Could the panel comment on what impact RSA's had on productivity and international exports of the recipient companies? Just to take a specific.
Everyone's looking at me for this. Well, I don't think there's really been too many studies in a correlation between RSA and that being the only driver of productivity and internationalisation and trade and export from Scotland. But it's one measure. But essentially, you know, there's a lot of different areas that focus into productivity and drive productivity, whether that's inward investment, whether that's leadership and management within businesses, whether that is a variety of digital utilisation, a quickening of your processes, you know. But we know for a fact that productivity hasn't moved over the past 10 years in Scotland, let alone the UK as a whole. So it's not just a Scottish problem, it's a UK phenomenon as well. RSA does play a role in potentially driving productivity. However, it's depending where you're investing and what type of businesses you're investing in. So if you look at emerging new sectors like AI and data, with RSA you have to write a 5-year business plan. But if I was sat in an AI and data new startup and wanted to get some funding to locate here, how the hell can I write a 5-year business plan for where my business is going to be when that sector is going to move significantly over the next few years, and let alone that impact be felt across any sector, to be quite honest, in terms of automation, AI and data, where that's heading to. So it's really hard to pin down RSA as a key driver of economic productivity in Scotland. It's one of them, and it's linked to it, and it does support it. But essentially, as I come back to, once you've received an RSA grant, how do you then ensure that your business is using that grant effectively enough? And it's not just about the driver of jobs, but it's the driver of innovation within your businesses to create further work, create further economic opportunity, and create further productivity. Now, if RSA could start to evaluate and measure that a bit better, I think, therefore, we get to the answer to your question, Colin.
Well, just taking an extension of what you're saying there, the Works Centre for Local Economic Growth case study on a UK-wide basis found that the RSA policy had positive impacts for small firms, but no impact for large firms. And the authors of that report or case study speculated that this was because larger firms could game the system and receive the subsidy without actually complying with the requirement to create jobs, which is rather an interesting thought.
Yeah, I can't comment because I've not seen the study, and I won't wish to comment too much further on that. But I can imagine if you're an SME as such, and your challenge and want is to grow, and you want to support your local community and local region, you know, you're going to drive that forward. I suspect in larger businesses, I suspect they wish for the same, but I can't comment until I've actually read the study, Colin, unfortunately.
Just very briefly, I think I agree with all the points Matt made. RSA is a relatively small tool available to the Enterprise Agency. It is quite difficult to pick out what impact did one particular tool have on productivity and international exports. The thing that jumps out at me is that regional selective assistance, the reporting on it by the enterprise agencies, and I think we had a report last week, shows how many offers were made to companies, how many were accepted, how many jobs have they promised, how many jobs have they safeguarded. And I'm going to go back to the communication from Scottish Enterprise to yourselves over Cayenne. There seems to be a lack of prioritising exactly the things you say. For those companies that got RSA, what was their turnover? How profitable were they? What was the productivity in the workforce before, during and after completion of the RSA project? They have that information. In the committee meeting last week, they said they've got it. They just don't publish it. I would prefer to have the hard data, the baseline information, to say how many jobs are we talking about, the turnover, the differences in productivity, and show those changes over time. If you need to show it over 5 years or 3 years to give it a more consistent picture, that's fine. But the reporting at the moment focusing on how many jobs were promised. And that doesn't really get down to the kind of the actual change on the ground.
Economic impact, a large part of it is job creation. Why are we not looking backwards and seeing what was achieved, so we know if we're putting the money into the right places?
I think that's a very good question.
Okay.
but it's readily solvable. But if you go to an RSA report, it will say we've promised 30-40 million pounds. The companies have told us they will create so many jobs. What we're not so good at reporting is a very clear table to say how many jobs were created back in 2005, 2010, 2015. Did they deliver on their plans?
It's a very basic question to ask.
It does.
Can't understand why there's no answer to it. I mean, do you have a view, does the panel have a view on the actual economic impact results that are quoted for RSA? Are they realistic? You're just saying that the emphasis is on jobs promised and then nothing. So are we realistic in accepting what's being put forward?
Could I put forward a case for the defence of what's been put? There's plenty of reasons to criticise what's been put forward. Appraisal and evaluation is difficult. And it's very hard to get precise numbers, but you try and do the best you can and hope that any errors you make might cancel themselves out and they don't all point in one direction. The problem we have with RSA is you are talking about trying to help companies that are facing challenges in areas that the market has found it more difficult to invest in. And so I think one of the people you had at your committee a couple of weeks ago was saying, if we're going to create employment in South East in the Highlands, that's worth more than a big urban centre, and they're absolutely right. So when you try to do the economic impact, the only thing you're trying to do, whether it's through sophisticated econometric analysis or business surveys, you're trying to provide the context in which you achieve those outcomes. So if you've created a small number of jobs, but in a deprived area in desperate need of jobs, it's probably worth a lot more than an intervention that's going to create jobs in the centre of Glasgow or Edinburgh. And that's what you're trying to do with impact. But what is being missed is precisely the question you asked. You can't really do that kind of detailed analysis without having a good quality baseline. So there might be good reasons why you're giving a bit more money to a particular area to create a smaller number of jobs, but tell us how many jobs were created and sustained over the 10-year period in that area, rather than jumping into the context.
Given the limited size of the funds that are available through RSA, from what you're saying, we'd be better investing in smaller companies rather than larger. The economic impact is let's not necessarily take Euston as an example, but is the economic impact greater putting money into a small company perhaps in a rural area, for example, rather than giving it to, I don't know, one of the big multinationals? Yes.
I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, this was the main reason why the Highlands and Islands Development Board was set up in 1965, I think, that you know, certain areas were disadvantaged compared with the central belt, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and that you needed to give additional assistance you know, to those areas. And that's still the case. That's been the reasoning behind the South of Scotland Development Agency, whatever its name is. Again, on the basis that many businesses in central Scotland don't need assistance. They can, you know, get on their own. And yet in the rural areas, because of disadvantages of lack of labour, additional transport costs, you need, you know, subsidies there. Now, in many other countries, what happens is you just get a specific grant. So if you're in a rural area, you get 25%. There's no selective assistance to it. It's an automatic grant in countries like Denmark and Norway. Whereas here in Scotland, you know, we've gone through this selective assistance with account managers in SE and HIE. But certainly, you know, the principle of rural areas requiring more assistance than Glasgow and Edinburgh, I think, is still very valid.
Given everything that's been said, at the moment, does RSA actually offer value for money in terms of the investment made?
I personally, I think so, but as I said to the committee earlier, RSA accounts for about 20-25% of the expenditure of Scottish Enterprise and Highlands Enterprise. About 20% is admin. The rest is on other expenditures. And I'm much more disappointed with what these bodies have been doing with the other expenditures than RSA. I think RSA has basically, you know, been very effective. The other assistance from these bodies has been much less effective.
Does any other member of the panel have a comment on that?
I was going to say, I think our members do view that our RSA has been effective. I agree, Tony, on that completely. I think there's an element of job creation and productivity that we're not understanding here. Is in the sense is that, are we creating jobs for jobs' sake, or are we creating productivity in a firm that will evolve and create higher value jobs over a certain amount of time? And that makes us more competitive as an economy. And I think where you could improve RSA, and I think it is a continuous improvement of RSA rather than a complete rewrite or rewash of it, is around actually looking at the productivity of firm to then directly lead you to better paid jobs and actually probably more fair work jobs in the long term, rather than just saying we're going to create 200 jobs in 2 years' time at all costs. It's a bit perverse in a sense that that is the actual challenge, and actually the challenge should be increasing profit, increasing productivity, increasing exporting, increasing the efficiency of your business, which will lead to more direct investment, which will lead to better jobs, increased living standards, and increased wages in that region. And if we can add that into the mix in RSA, I think as a continuous improvement, we'll succeed.
Helen, I think you were interested.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe take a slightly different view and say that I think Fair Work is actually the key to sort of improving some of this area, and a real focus on true fair work outcomes for workers across the economy. And I think if you sort of overlay that with a focus on the foundational economy, and then a focus on work that stays within the community, so investment that stays within the community and sort of supports workers in a local area, in areas that are foundational and that need to be in the location and can't be stripped away particularly easily. I think that unlocks sort of economies of scale really within local and rural within rural communities. And I think if there is a strong fair work focus within this work, I think we will see improvements in how the money is used and the outcomes that we have in terms of people's living standards, which I think fundamentally is what we're trying to achieve.
Just to say, I thought I agree with most of what Helen and Matt were saying. But with slightly contrasting views there, I would say the overall point is we actually don't know fully. We don't have the evidence to answer your question. even though it's sat there within the enterprise agencies. They will have a database of all the companies, how they performed over the last 10, 15 years. And Alan's absolutely right. We should be measuring how much are they paying their workers. Did that increase? Is it matching the living wage? Are we pushing up productivity in these companies? And the basic question you've asked is say, is that effect larger or smaller for larger companies, in companies in rural and remote areas and so on? Well, we don't know because it's not published. And the criticism I would level at the reporting mechanisms put forward at the moment is the enterprise agencies have confused reporting the success of an administration system with measures of success. I think Matt mentioned it. It's the viability, profitability of the company long term and how the workforce is treated. Those are the things that should be measured. And again, I come back, when the committee pressed Scottish Enterprise on CAIM, they reported a 4-fold return on investment and a 10-to-1 capital investment leverage. They didn't mention those things. The company died on the operating table. That should be the thing that's measured in the report, in the monitoring frameworks.
A few follow-ups on this from, first of all, Willie Coffey and then Dean Lockhart.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just firstly on the point that Tony made about Prestwick Airport earlier, I really must come back on that. I can hardly think it's an example of political bias in this case, given it's such a strategic asset, given that the constituency is represented by a member that's not a member of a government party. So I don't think it can be described as that. Thank you for the comment. Could I follow up this line that Colin Beattie led there? RSA has been with us since 1972, 47 years. Why now are we saying things, Richard, like we have to measure better what we're doing 47 years later? What on earth's going on? What I'm keen to get your views on is the interventions that RSA has brought to Scotland over those years, has it led to sustainability in either those businesses or those communities that they then do not rely on further RSA investment to sustain? Or is RSA itself the only mechanism that will sustain jobs and employment in our communities in Scotland? What would you say to that?
Okay, I'll add some quick points for everyone else jumps in. The reason we're still measuring this nearly 50 years later is the things we're trying to measure have changed. So in 2015, we decided to put our shoulder on the wheel on inclusive growth. But you can go back over the last 50 years and different governments of different stripes have changed what we're trying to get out of public interventions. And you know, you can go back a little further and say at some point we started to look at kind of sustainability and the environment as well. So it's perfectly natural that we would say the way we're measuring these things needs to change, and it's going to need to change again in the future when we decide on different priorities. The point I was just discussing with Tony, having been involved in economic development, not quite for 50 years, but certainly for some time, is back in 2010, I think Scottish Enterprise produced a figure saying every pound it was going to invest would generate £8.80 and would return £8.80 to the Scottish economy. I think I've got that right. This committee found a similar figure, I think, last year. It was up to about £9 for every pound invested. That's not true. It can't possibly be true. They said we'd get that return before 2020. If that were true, we'd be sat on something the size of Norway's oil wealth fund. But we're not. So, but occasionally you get these things wrong. Occasionally there's a bit of optimism bias in the way that you do this. You hope these things work out. But if they don't, it's important to understand why. And rather than placing the emphasis on saying this could have been brilliant or we hope this would work, we should be like, you know, fiscal ferrets and saying, well, why did that go wrong? You know, what could we have done differently? How can we shape interventions in the future? For 50 odd years, for a very understandable reason, we've not been terribly good at that.
But where are the success stories then? Surely RSA has been a success in some areas, and what communities in Scotland or companies are now successful as a result of the RSA intervention, but who do not any longer need that intervention? Are there any? Tony.
I think so. If you look at what's happened, say, over the last 10 years, we had a big boom in the North Sea oil industry, not just in the Aberdeen area, but elsewhere. And then oil prices collapsed, and there was a recession, which the enterprise agencies couldn't have predicted, and they've had to cope with that. We've then had Brexit at the last few years, and that's caused a lot of problems and uncertainties, reduced investment. But what it has had, one beneficial effect is, say, the tourism industry. Because of the collapse in the value of the pound, the tourism in Scotland has been booming. So it would be very difficult, I think, for anybody in the agencies, say 2 years ago, to predict the boom we've had in tourism. I can remember doing various studies for the Scotch whisky industry in the 70s and 80s, which was struggling then. And the Scotch whisky industry is booming. The digital companies in Dundee have done extremely well out of RSA. So I think there are quite a few examples of industries that have done very well in the long run. But you've got to counter those with the collapse in North Sea oil and the current problems with Brexit.
Okay. Any other views, Mark, Helen? No? Okay.
Sorry?
I was just asking if Matt or Helen wanted to make a contribution. Is RSA itself the only means of providing sustainable jobs?
I mean, I think the problem here is that it's not, the system is often not that well joined up. So you know, they might receive RSA assistance, but that doesn't mean that they are receiving all the assistance that they could from the government or from other public agencies. So we had the example earlier of the wind turbines being produced, and it was very, very clear that the UK government could have put into their contracts that a certain proportion of the work had to be done in Scotland, and they chose not to do that. And because they chose not to do that, we now have a situation where that work is going offshore, and we, as the trade union movement, are having to run a very strong campaign against EDF, who are using the clauses that they have within their contracts that are absent from the UK government contracts to now put work into the BIFAB yards. We've managed to leverage that, but we shouldn't have to work so hard at it. We should be able to see these things coming through from the UK government, from the Scottish government, through through all the systems that we have to support the companies that were ultimately receiving public support in other ways. So why did we not finish the system? Why did we not finish the support in order to secure the work in the long term? And I think fundamentally it's a weakness within the system that it is in some ways divided up, and there isn't enough strategy and strategic priority around supporting these strategic assets in the long term.
Just very, very briefly, I agree in the main with what Tony suggested around the industries that it has supported over recent times, particularly the digital industry in Dundee, and that now being world leading and world leading jobs and such, so coming to Scotland as well through that. Where I'd like to focus on is probably what's coming down the river with Brexit in terms of how that will impact on RSA and how we may be required to look at the process of RSA to continue to sustain and support certain industries and communities at that point, because that will have an impact going forward. So, yeah, that's the point I'd like to add.
Okay, good.
All right, just to remind members that we're running sort of on at this stage, running out of time, so perhaps can be brief. Now, there's a follow-up from Dean Lockhart before we come to Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. Trying to make it brief, just to continue on the question of economic impact, because if you look at the Scottish Government's performance targets on the economy, none of the 8 targets are being met. I'd like to get the panel's views on why that might be the case, given the significant sums invested by the agencies through RSA and otherwise. And do you think confusion over inclusive growth as the overall strategy, what it means, is a factor in this economic underperformance? Because we heard last week from the agencies that inclusive growth means different things to different people. Richard, you're laughing.
I've got to stop that. You can. We don't have to critique the performance of Scotland's economy. The point that I've tried to draw out with what I've written down today and spoken about is that we've decided back in 2015 for 4 years we've had a strategy that focuses on inclusive growth. At the committee, I think last week, you asked the enterprise agencies, well, what do you mean by inclusive growth? How does it shape your policy decisions? And it was, well, it's a basket of things. I mean, no one actually described, this is what it means, this is how it helps shape our interventions, and this is what we do. What they pointed to was a diagnostic tool. The diagnostic tool has the 5 Ps, the productivity, population, and so on. The first line on productivity for what is inclusive growth says, growth is resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. We're 4 years later, and we have a statement at the top that says inclusive growth means inclusive growth. That kind of approach hasn't worked too well in trying to describe policy over the last few years. So I don't think we have a firm handle on it. I thought the Highlands and Islands representative last week actually did a pretty good job of actually saying we think it's place-based approaches, and actually that sounds entirely reasonable. We've heard today there's things we can measure on living wage and how the workforce is treated and so on. That seems entirely reasonable. But what we have in this diagnostic is something that, if it's really important, we should be able to describe it succinctly. We shouldn't need to take 15, 20 pages to describe a broad vision and actually have nothing to measure, because it means the agencies tasked with delivering this don't know what they're supposed to be doing.
Tony Mackay.
Two brief answers. First one, I think a lot of the targets have been far too optimistic, ambitious. I think, that when you apply for a grant, you're likely to give the most optimistic answers. And that means that, later on, things will be less successful. And it's a bit like Craig Levine and the manager of Hibs at the moment. I mean, do you really believe what they're saying about this football season? Right? So, and the second point is that I think what we've got to take into account is external problems like the recession in the North Sea oil industry and the problems caused by Brexit. So over the last 5 years, they've had a negative impact on many businesses, and because of that, the targets have not been met.
I think there hasn't been. I think there's a strategic understanding at the sort of the top ministerial level of what the relationship between inclusive growth and fair work is, but I think that hasn't necessarily filtered out into all agencies to the degree that it should have, even at this point. I think it's starting to improve. We're seeing signs that it's starting to improve. We're having more discussions with different agencies in different areas about fair work and what the contribution to fair work can be. But really, we're at early stages of that, and of early stages of that being built in a systematic way across sort of the activities of government in all the different genres. And in some ways, it's disappointing because our target is 2025 to see Scotland as a fair work society, and that seems a very, very close and a very, very daunting task, I think. And I think for workers on the ground, they hear fair work talked about a lot, but they don't see it in their own workplace and in their own work life. They don't see any change for this change in policy speak. And I think at some point we are going to have to see things moving in a way that can be measured, and in order for people to really have genuine faith in this agenda and in this approach from the government. So I think there is a lot of activity and there's a lot of emphasis and there's a lot of strategic leadership, but I still think we're trying to embed that, and I think confusion about what it truly means isn't necessarily helping that process.
Just very briefly, if you look at Scotland's productivity and try and increase Scotland's productivity, it goes back to what I said before. You increase living standards for all, you increase wages for all, you become more competitive into the international space around driving foreign direct investment and inward investment into the country. You attract more of it, which you would hope turn into better jobs as such for people, higher paying jobs, fairer work, not just pay with jobs, but fairer work jobs, better industries and sectors coming to Scotland too that already have these practices as part of their psyche as such when they land here. So if you add all that up, it goes back to how do you increase productivity, and RSA is one tool of that. And I go back to Tony's point around actually it's been really hard to increase productivity over the past 10 years since the financial crisis because of things like the North Sea oil downturn, because of things like the Brexit issues that we're seeing at the moment, reducing confidence in our economy as well, and for the fact we've not grasped this AI and data challenge in Scotland about how we best support our companies to utilise that technology to become more productive. And I welcome the Programme for Government's announcement on an AI strategy and data strategy for Scotland being rolled out too, because I think it will start to support us delivering more in those areas. But I go back to it, it's around increasing productivity, and that's how you create an economy for all. And how we do that, I think, is critical to the success of RSA and its continuous improvement over the next few years.
All right, I think we'll come now to Gordon MacDonald.
Just getting back to the question about value for money, I was having a look at the Scottish Enterprise RSA summary for 2018-19, and it said that 86% of the offers accepted were from Scottish-owned companies, but only 61% of the funding went to Scottish companies. And looking back to 2008, an evaluation report covering the year 2000 to 2004 found that Scottish-owned businesses received substantially lower levels of financial assistance compared to foreign or UK-owned businesses. So clearly that's been a long-term trend. Even if you take out the one-off large instances like 2018-19, you had Barclays that get £6.6 million as a one-off. If you even take that out, Scottish companies got on average a lower level of grant and have done over the last 20 years. Is there an underlying reason for that, why that would be the case? Yeah.
I think very briefly that most of the success, or a lot of the successful companies have been export companies, and many of the successful exporters in Scotland are now internationally owned. Okay, I take the whisky industry again. Okay, 20 or 30 years ago, the whisky industry was largely in Scottish hands, and now it's been taken over by the international companies like Diageo. They've been successful because they can get into the export markets much more successfully. The same, I think, with the energy, the oil services, that the more successful companies have been the exporters, and they've tended to be taken over by foreign-owned companies.
The reason for asking the question was actually a comment that Helen Martin asked about the importance of investment staying in the community, because obviously companies are coming to Scotland to invest because they want to improve their profitability. But of course, if we encourage more foreign investment, whether it's from the UK or overseas, then effectively the profits from that are flowing out of the country, and many of the suppliers they use or services they use again are from out with the country. So we are not getting the multiplier effect that we should have. So I'm just wondering, you know, how do we address that?
I mean, I think it is important that we do consider ownership models when we consider who we are investing in. And I do think it's important that we also consider supporting smaller companies who are rooted in the economy, supporting companies that are within the foundational economy, so therefore rooted in the community. They might be large multinational companies, but they are still rooted in the community. And if we sort of consider those place-based elements within the grant-making procedure as one of the things that we consider within the grant-making procedure, I think it does help that money being retained within the community and having that sort of multiplier effect that you were talking about. And it is about ultimately trying to get the most out of these sorts of grants in terms of that kind of community impact. Because we have to remember that companies will always seek assistance, but that doesn't necessarily mean, particularly large companies, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they absolutely need that assistance in order to come to Scotland. So I think what we're trying to do is really focus in on who needs the assistance, how that assistance will then multiply out and support the community, how it supports workers within that community to have a livelihood that is actually something that they can live on and is sustainable. And if we can do those things just a little bit better, I think it's something that could pay dividends in how the economy then starts to function and how it starts to function for Scottish people in particular.
Richard.
Just again, I keep saying this, but I agree with everything Helen said. But the point about foreign-owned companies getting more money, foreign-owned companies in Scotland tend to be bigger than Scottish companies. We've been particularly poor at growing companies in Scotland. We haven't really produced any significant companies of any scale for a long time, and we need to get better at that. And that's not necessarily a fault of RSA, that's a much wider system issue. But I fully agree about the issues around ownership, and you're absolutely right. If we actually have a large company that's owned overseas or elsewhere in the UK, or even has a public shareholding, the profits are distributed to shareholders. If you look at things like cooperatives and so on, the earnings are retained in the local community and can be distributed, so you have that multiplier effect of more of the wealth is retained, and you have a more sustainable community in the long run.
I accept that point, but do you know how many cooperatives have actually had RSA as support?
I think Cooperative Development Scotland would probably be the place to go to find that out.
Right. Mark, will you want me?
Yeah, just very quickly, and again, I'm in very much agreement with what the panel have already said. On the Indigenous Scottish business side, there is an opportunity there to do a bit more in terms of the RSA grant and where its focus might be, and for all the reasons that Helen said, so I won't go into those in detail, but there's a risk there as well, and in terms of how we de-risk or use RSA as a de-risk to Indigenous Scottish businesses that do want to grow, and how we start to see that in a bit more detail, and some of that can go down to the business model of the company, who its board of directors, how it's set up, is it a strategic asset like we were talking before? How do we start to look at these things in a different manner to give opportunities there and de-risk, I suppose, the opportunity for them to grow? Because I think that is part of why our Indigenous Scottish businesses aren't taking their company to the next given challenge, or the next new market, or the next opportunity.
And just on that point of de-risk, my final question is, if you look at the level of grant to the jobs planned, and accept all the caveats we've said earlier about whether there's no proper measure in place, but the average support per job is lower in Scotland than it is given to UK or foreign companies. And basically, does that not represent better value for money? The fact that it takes less to support a job application, a job in Scotland, that for somebody that's applied for RSA?
I won't read into it as much as you would, Gordon, for obvious reasons. But I hear where you're going, and I hear what you're saying. And, it is an argument that can be presented, yeah.
Anybody else?
Just for that interpretation, because it could be that there's more capital involved elsewhere, and it could be it's higher pay. It might be a smaller number of jobs amongst foreign companies, but with a higher wage, or vice versa. So you shouldn't read too much into a fairly blunt statistic.
Take your advice. Thanks very much.
Richard Lyle.
I think we're coming to near the end, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll try and curtail my questions. We are, or we were, a company, a country that developed so many inventions over the years. Yes, Mr. Mackay, I remember the 60s and the 70s, but in the 60s you had We're Backing Britain, the campaign. In the 70s you had the Winter of Discontent. So they weren't as great as what you thought they were. On Prestwick, you remind me of that song, but I certainly won't be saying Prestwick no more. As far as I'm concerned, we're going to safeguard Prestwick. So, in line with my colleague's comments earlier. So, have we lost the fact that we're not using RSA? RSA, Regional Selected Assistance, used to retain jobs, improve jobs, encourage jobs, promote jobs. You know, but also the point, Helen, you made earlier, we're not buying locally. We're buying where we shouldn't be buying. Our carbon footprint is growing because we're going so far away. And that's the problem. But as my other colleague has said, we have high employment. We aren't as bad as what other colleagues make us out to be. So, to end, how do you believe, do you have any suggestions of changes you would like to see made to RSA or wider enterprise agency support for business? Should we change things? Should we invent more things? Should we get back to the powerhouse that Tony made earlier on, back to the 60s?
I think it's very positive that it is going to look more strongly at fair work outcomes, and it's going to consider only jobs paid above the living wage. I think that is a good start. I don't think it's quite good enough. I would like to see it much more broadly on looking at fair work in a much broader sense. But I do think that's a good beginning. And I would like to see much more of a sort of industrial strategy coming from the Scottish Government as a whole, and indeed the UK Government, because I think it needs to link together really, because we do need to see industries being supported through a whole range of procurement options. So, for example, you know, we should have a procurement strategy for ferries. We should have you know, strategic sort of overview of how ports are going to be developed to support island communities grow. Those sorts of things that we're in desperate need of at the minute, and it's not really we're not really seeing that kind of drive in the way that it fully could be. But I think there is a lot of potential here with the tools that we put in place around inclusive growth and with the tools that we put in place around fair work. But it's just about really maximising that, I think, to the degree that it could be.
I think there's two clear opportunities for RSA and how it could focus and change and look at new emerging sectors such as AI and digital that I've discussed before, and that will impact every sector and every industry in Scotland over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And how RSA responds to that is going to be critical to the success of our industries and sectors, and it's an opportunity for us to be world leading and get back to those halcyon 60s days that I can only watch on TV and historical programmes. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. And the other one is, you know, First Minister announced a climate emergency 3, 4, 6 months ago. Clean growth, great sector for us to be in. The expertise that lies in the North East and beyond in Scotland is critical to how we might look at RSA in the future to support industries in that particular sector as well. So great opportunities to be world leading in those two things.
Tony, give us your view on where we are now.
Well, I think that we've been very innovative in some industries. One of my favourites is alcohol. If you look at what's happening with whiskey and gin and you know, beer, there's been a huge increase in Scotland, and not just big firms, but I mean a lot of small firms in Orkney and elsewhere are doing that. We've talked before about Dundee. you know, the IT firms there, they're very successful.
And
Yes.
games and
Yes.
etc. And world leader in games is just across the road for here.
Yes, yeah. But the big disappointment for me at the present time, the one I mentioned before, is marine energy, wave energy, tidal energy. We've got a coastline, we've got the natural resources to do that, and we're letting that opportunity disappear.
Can I thank you very much? Thank you, Kinnear.
All right, thank you very much to the panel. We'll conclude that item of the agenda now, and I'll suspend the meeting and we'll move to private session.